Welcome, and thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through time. Tonight, we turn softly down a corridor lined not with torches, but with painted lanterns. Behind silk-draped partitions and carved wooden doors, far from the public square and even farther from the battlefield, we enter a world of hushed footsteps, bowed heads, and carefully measured words. Our destination is the Forbidden City, not the public image of grandeur you may know, with its blazing red walls and tiled roofs, but the quieter, inner sanctums where the business of the emperor's household pulsed steadily behind layers of etiquette and ritual. In particular, we follow the quiet figures who moved within this inner world, men who were not quite free, not quite servants, and not quite masters. They were royal eunuchs, and their lives offer one of the most fascinating, intimate, and complex lenses into Chinese imperial life. Stripped of family, powerfully close to the throne, often mistrusted yet utterly indispensable, these men lived lives of rigid routine, political intrigue, and sometimes tremendous influence. Through 25 gentle chapters, we will explore what it was really like to live as one of them. The daily rituals, the whispered secrets, the quiet sorrow, and the carefully balanced dignity of a life entirely shaped by the palace walls. Tonight is not a night for haste or dramatics. So settle in. Let the rhythm of history unfold softly before you. Let us begin, where so many of these stories did not in triumph or tragedy, but in the quiet struggle of a single day. Imagine waking before the sun has fully risen, the sky outside still draped in a gentle blue-grey mist. The corridors are already cool and hushed, heavy with the scent of oiled wood and faint incense. The stone floor beneath your feet is smooth from years of careful steps, never hurried, never loud. You rise without complaint. You have no family to speak of, no wife to greet, no children to rouse. Your room is modest. The bed is little more than a thin mat, and your belongings are sparse. You dress in robes of muted silk, simple but finely made. Everything about your appearance must reflect care and humility. You are a eunuch of the Forbidden City. Your tasks today are not grand or glorious, but they are essential. They begin not with food nor with rest, but with readiness. You attend to the chambers of a minor concubine. Later, perhaps, you will be called to deliver a scroll, to oversee the lighting of lamps, or to fetch a particular type of tea at a particular hour. You are always nearby, but never obtrusive. Your life is routine, but never relaxed. The hierarchy is strict. You answer to other eunuchs older, more seasoned, some more favored. There is a constant sense of performance, though no audience applauds. It is a performance of deference, silence, and attentiveness. One mistake, a glance too bold, a delay too long, a whisper overheard, and your position could shift, downward, permanently. You eat little and often alone. Meals are plain, a bowl of rice, perhaps a vegetable, maybe a piece of preserved tofu if it is a good day. You eat with discipline. Even here, you are watched. You keep meticulous care of your appearance. Though your status is ambiguous, you must remain presentable. Clean robes, shaven head, polished shoes. You bow often. You kneel when commanded. You never raise your voice, never call attention to yourself. The Forbidden City is enormous, but you move through it as if you were part of the furniture, seen but unnoticed, necessary but silent. At times, you pass close to power. You may glimpse the emperor himself or hear his voice from behind a curtain, but power is not yours. You live beside it, like a shadow beside a flame visible, but always at risk of being snuffed out. You sleep lightly. You do not know when you may be called. Sometimes the night brings rest. Sometimes it brings a message, a command, a sudden shift in duties. You accept this. You must. The rhythm of your life is built not on freedom, but on the expectations of others. You are trusted, in a sense, but never quite embraced. You are not quite one of the servants, but not one of the ruling class either. You exist in a narrow space in between. It is a space shaped by silence, by careful gestures, by secrets known and secrets kept. And yet, this life is not wholly bleak. It carries its own kind of pride. You serve the most powerful man in the world. You walk where few are allowed to tread. You are part of the inner machinery of the empire, but you are always on edge, always aware, always measuring each step, each word, each breath. For many, the weight of this life would be unbearable, the loneliness, the scrutiny, the absolute surrender of personal desire to the will of the court. And so, in truth, most would not last a day. But you, if only for tonight, walk quietly beside them. Now, let us drift gently from the soft hush of corridors into the slow rhythm of waves. The sea, vast and rolling, may seem far from the walls of the forbidden city, but for one eunuch, the world beyond those walls would become his realm. His name was Zheng, and though he began as a palace servant, he would become one of the most extraordinary figures in Chinese history, a man whose voyages stretched across oceans, who met foreign kings, and who commanded a fleet so immense that it seemed to swallow the horizon. But it did not begin that way. Imagine yourself as a child, born in the highlands of Yunnan in the year 1371. Your family is Muslim, your heritage proud. Your name then is not Zheng, but Mahi. Your father is a respected figure, perhaps descended from Mongol nobility. You grow up hearing stories of travel and empires. But history has its own tides. The Ming dynasty rises in the east, and with it comes conquest. When the Ming army sweeps into Yunnan, your world changes. Your father is killed, and you, a child of around 10, are taken as a prisoner of war. You are brought to the capital not to be executed, but to be transformed. There, in the heart of imperial power, the ceremony of your castration is performed. We will not linger on the act itself. Let us only say it was final and irreversible, and that from that moment on you would never return to the world as you once knew it. Your name is changed, your body is changed, your future is rewritten. But he is observant, he listens, he learns, and before long he catches the attention of a powerful man, Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, one of the emperor's sons. The prince sees in him not only a loyal servant, but a sharp mind and an unwavering presence. Over the years, their bond deepens. When Zhu Di rises in rebellion, claiming the throne and becoming the Yongle emperor, he is at his side. As emperor, Zhu Di rewards his trusted eunuch. He grants him a new name, Zheng, and he entrusts him with something astonishing, not a post in the palace, but command of a fleet the likes of which the world had never seen. Now picture the scale, dozens of ships, massive treasure junks towering above the waves, some said to be over 400 feet long, though scholars now debate the exact measurements. Still, their size was immense, and their presence on the sea undeniable. These were not warships, though they carried arms. They were emissaries of China's wealth, bearing silk, porcelain, and bronze. Their mission to project power and gather tribute, yes, but also to explore, to establish diplomatic ties, and to return with strange goods and stories from far-off lands. He led not one voyage, but 7. Between the years 1415 and 1433, he sailed as far as the Arabian Peninsula, the east coast of Africa, and possibly beyond. He visited Java, India, Sri Lanka, Hormuz. He met sultans, kings, and merchants. He left stone inscriptions in Tamil. He brought back giraffes. And through it all, he remained what he had become so many years before, a eunuch. A man trusted not only because of his loyalty, but because he had no children, no ambitions beyond his duty. Or so it was believed. But there is power in that kind of silence. He maintained meticulous records. He built temples to the sea goddess Mazu. He made offerings. He honored both his Muslim roots and his Buddhist influences. He did not seek personal glory, but he left behind a legacy written across oceans. In time, the winds of court politics shifted. Later emperors were less interested in foreign voyages. The fleets were recalled. The docks grew quiet. And Zheng He, old and weary, sailed one last time. He died at sea, or perhaps shortly after returning home. His grave, if it exists, has never been conclusively found. And yet, his life remains a map of contradictions. A eunuch who commanded armies, a servant who shaped diplomacy, a man once taken as a captive who came to represent the face of a mighty empire abroad. Zheng He's story is not one of triumph in the traditional sense. It is a story of service, of loyalty, and of complex identity woven through with ceremony and wind, silence and command. As the waves grow calm once more, we return now to the Forbidden City. From the salt air and distant ports, we step back inside, into polished corridors and paper lanterns. Ahead lies another layer of this strange and layered world. Let us walk a little deeper. Now we descend even further into the private rituals and irreversible transformations that marked the beginning of a eunuch's life within the imperial court. It is a subject surrounded by silence, folklore, and forgotten records, yet it formed the quiet foundation of thousands of lives across the centuries. Let us step carefully. The act of becoming a eunuch in imperial China was not merely a medical procedure, it was a profound social transition. It was, for many, the end of one existence and the beginning of another. And for most of these men, it began in poverty. Imagine yourself born into a family with few resources, in the countryside or the outskirts of a city. Perhaps there are too many mouths to feed. Perhaps your father sees no future for you in farming. Or perhaps your village has heard that the palace is recruiting again. The rumors always traveled quietly. If you are young enough, if you are healthy, if your body is intact, you might be accepted into the inner court. And in exchange, your family might receive a sum of silver. Sometimes the boy was eager, dreaming of satin robes and golden halls. Other times, he had no choice. By the Qing dynasty, private castration had been made illegal, yet it continued clandestine, risky, and often performed by men who had themselves once gone through the same ritual. It was done in secret rooms, with the help of herbal compresses, silken ropes, and sharp knives. But this is not a place for vivid imagery. Let us simply say that the body was changed. All male genitalia were removed, testes and penis together, typically in a single procedure. The wound was bound. The pain was immense. The healing was slow. Urination, now performed through a narrow opening, could be complicated for the rest of one's life. Infections were common. Some died. The boy would then preserve the removed organs, often in a sealed jar. This object, quiet, private, and seldom discussed, was referred to as the Bao Jian, or precious bundle. Why? Because if the eunuch served the court faithfully and was granted permission, he might be buried with it, reunited in death with what was taken in life. Once recovered, the young eunuch in training would present himself at the gates of the Forbidden City, carrying documentation, references, and the jar. Palace officials would inspect the body to verify his status, a process both humiliating and necessary. And if approved, he would step through the gate, not just as a visitor, but as property of the court. His new life began with indoctrination. The first months were filled with cleaning, watching, learning. The older eunuchs trained the young. How to speak, how to bow, how to step silently in embroidered slippers, how to keep a straight face, how to hold a tray, how to kneel, how to disappear. Many were assigned to simple chores, lighting lanterns, scrubbing floors, folding laundry. The outer court held those with lesser duties, the inner court those with years of seniority and experience. Advancement was possible but never swift. And always there was surveillance. Eunuchs were watched not only by the court, but by each other. The palace feared their closeness to the emperor, their access to secrets, their influence over daily life. Trust was a privilege, and it came in drops, not floods. Even so, some rose. In time, a eunuch might be given a title supervisor of ceremonies, keeper of the robes, director of household provisions. These roles were accompanied by status, sometimes even wealth, but they never escaped their identity. The term for eunuch in Chinese Taijian literally meant chamberlain, but it was always understood in its deeper context. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into these early rites. In Beijing, near the remains of the Ming Dynasty city walls, scholars have uncovered burial markers, official records, and even medical tools associated with this practice. At the eunuch tombs, south of the capital, quiet stone epitaphs describe men who lived for decades in the shadows of emperors. Some inscriptions are proud, others strangely muted. Rituals surrounded every stage of the eunuch's life, especially its beginning. The transition was seen not just as physical, but spiritual. In Taoist traditions, castration was believed by some to enhance internal alchemy, to redirect life energy. In court culture, it was treated as purification, removal of desire, of threat, of independence. But beneath the layers of ceremonial language lay human lives, lives shaped by necessity, by sacrifice, by enforced detachment. And despite all this, the indoctrination often succeeded. Many young boys entered the court filled with confusion, pain, or ambition. Within a few short years, they became indistinguishable from their elders, precise, silent, exacting. Their personalities, like their voices, became high-pitched and measured, their ambitions channeled into loyalty and vigilance. And so the palace remade them not only through ritual and hierarchy, but through rhythm, the rhythm of obedience, of repetition, of stillness. Over time, these men came to embody the very structure of the imperial household, tight, controlled, enduring. As we step now from this initiation into the spaces they would inhabit, we carry with us not only the facts, but the weight of that transformation. From poverty to palace, from child to eunuch, from voice to echo. Let us continue. Now that we have seen the threshold a eunuch crossed to enter imperial service, let us explore the space that would come to define his world. The forbidden city, mystical, immense, and meticulously ordered, was not merely a palace. It was a city unto itself, closed to most, guarded with ceremony, and built to project an eternal, unshakable order. Imagine yourself standing at its outer gate, just before dawn. The great red walls stretch high above your head. Golden roof tiles shimmer faintly in the morning mist. The air smells faintly of incense, dry brick dust, and the faintest echo of cooked millet from a nearby servant's quarter. As you step inside, the noise of the outside world dims. No carts rumbling, no hawkers shouting, only footsteps on stone, measured and deliberate. This is a space of silence and structure, where even the wind seems to follow protocol. The Forbidden City, or Cheng in Chinese, meaning purple forbidden enclosure, was constructed in the early 15th century during the reign of the Yongle Emperor. It served as the seat of imperial power for over 500 years, from the Ming dynasty to the fall of the Qing. Its layout followed strict cosmic principles based on Confucian ideals and ancient geomancy. The city was designed on a north-south axis. The emperor, considered the son of heaven, lived at its center, facing south, commanding both spiritual and temporal authority. Every hall, pavilion, and courtyard reinforced this celestial hierarchy. For a eunuch, this world was not abstract. It was lived in steps. You might begin your day in the outer court, sweeping stone paths or polishing bronze lanterns. The scale here is vast, towering halls like the Hall of Supreme Harmony, used for coronations and state rituals. The plaza, before it could hold 10,000 people, though it rarely did. And yet, most of this grandeur was not meant for the common citizen. It was ceremonial, symbolic. Beyond these monumental spaces lies the inner court, the true heart of palace life. Smaller courtyards, quieter pavilions, and a sense of intimacy layered with control. This is where the imperial family lived, the emperor, empress, concubines, and their children. Here, the daily rhythm slowed but grew no less precise. Every movement followed protocol. The emperor's meals, for example, involved dozens of attendants, each responsible for a single dish, or step one for pouring tea, one for testing the food, one for serving, one for clearing. Eunuchs played many of these roles, unseen but essential. The empress resided in her own compound, as did favoured concubines. Their pavilions were connected by covered walkways and narrow corridors, patrolled by palace women and lower-ranking eunuchs. In these spaces, emotion swirled beneath a surface of calm. Jealousies, favours, and unspoken rivalries played out in glances and gestures. And yet, despite its intimacy, the inner court could feel vast. For a eunuch, it might take years to know even a small portion of it intimately. There were over 800 buildings within the Forbidden City, some used daily, others rarely entered. Their names: Pavilion of the Fragrance of Dew, Hall of Mental Cultivation, Hall of Heavenly Purity, evoked peace, but often hid stress and surveillance. Eunuchs occupied a strange place in this universe. They were not quite nobles, yet not commoners, not monks, though celibate, not women, though they lived among them. Their quarters, often tucked behind service halls or near the Palace of Prolonging Happiness, were modest. But from these quiet corners, they moved outward into every corner of the palace. The power of the emperor was absolute, but his presence was limited. Eunuchs filled that space. They carried his orders. They observed his moods. They managed the gatekeepers and the gatekeepers of gatekeepers. They became the veins through which the will of the dragon throne flowed. There were rules for everything: how to address an empress, how many paces to walk behind an official, how to bow depending on the time of day. One mistake, a misstep, a word too soon could mean a beating, demotion, or removal. And yet, despite this constant tension, life inside the Forbidden City could settle into a rhythm. Each day brought rituals, morning offerings to ancestors, mid-morning reports, evening meals served precisely at dusk. The seasons brought changes in dress, new flower arrangements in the courtyards, lanterns in winter, open windows in summer. Even the birds were accounted for: small cages of songbirds kept to add music to the otherwise measured silence. The contrast with the world outside was immense. Beyond the walls, markets bustled, families argued, fishermen cast nets, scholars recited poems. But here, time felt suspended. Things happened slowly, and yet without pause. To live in the Forbidden City was to become part of something larger than yourself, not only a place, but a system. And for the eunuchs, this often meant becoming invisible. Their presence was constant but never foregrounded. They were observers, servants, guardians of routine. And in return they gained something few commoners ever saw: access to the true machinery of power. As we leave the marbled steps and curved rooftops behind, let us pause to appreciate what it meant to belong to such a place, not in name, but in body, in time, in spirit. To serve not one master, but the idea of order itself. The next time we return to these halls, it will be in the earliest hours of the day, when the palace stirs from its stillness, and the rituals of wakefulness begin. Now let us walk softly into the quietest moment of the day, the hour before the sun breaches the horizon, when most of the city still sleeps, but within the Forbidden City the day has already begun. For the Emperor of China, waking was never a private affair. It was a ritual, a performance, a reaffirmation of his role as the Son of Heaven, and a cue for the entire palace to stir into motion. And for the eunuchs who served him, the dawn was not simply a beginning, it was an orchestrated sequence of duties, practiced and refined through generations. Imagine, for a moment, that you are one of the trusted inner court eunuchs assigned to the emperor's household. You have been awake for over an hour, your robes pressed and tied, your hair neatly covered, your posture composed. Outside, the darkness is not absolute, it carries the faintest tinge of blue, like the breath of morning yet to take form. Your first task is silence. Moving through the stone corridors, your footsteps are deliberate, cushioned by the soft soles of your shoes. You pass beneath high eaves and carved latticework, lanterns swaying gently in the breeze. At this hour, everything seems to breathe slowly. The Emperor sleeps in a series of inner chambers, shielded by thick brocade curtains and layers of polished wood screens. But before he awakens, the surroundings must be prepared. Another eunuch has already entered the chamber's outer threshold to light the incense, a soft, woody fragrance that signals the beginning of day. The smell is never overwhelming. It is subtle. It blends with the natural dampness of the morning air and the ever-present scent of aged cedar. By now, others are arriving: the dresser, the scribe, the steward of warm water. Each has a defined role, and none dares overstep it. You may nod slightly to each other, but conversation is minimal. It is not out of coldness, but reverence. The entire process is guided by protocol, not personality. In an adjoining room, robes are laid out, chosen carefully based on the day's rituals, the season, even the astrological readings for that particular date. If it is the beginning of spring, pale greens or blues may be chosen. On important ceremonial days, brighter reds and golds are used. Each thread has meaning. Each button reflects status. The water is warmed, not hot, but gently steaming. It is poured into a silver basin where a cloth awaits. The eunuch assigned to face washing is among the most trusted, for they will be the first to approach the Emperor directly that morning. Now, a soft bell is rung once, then again. Not to wake the Emperor abruptly, but to invite consciousness. A respectful gesture between worlds, sleep and wakefulness, dream and duty. Inside the chamber, the Emperor stirs. You do not meet his gaze. Instead, you bow deeply. A lower eunuch gently draws back the first curtain. Another folds aside the second. The Emperor does not speak yet. He does not need to. You offer the cloth with both hands, lowering your gaze. He washes his face. The cloth is retrieved without comment. A fresh robe is presented and tied with practiced hands. The act of dressing, for the Emperor, is not casual. It is another layer of ceremony. Next, the morning scrolls are delivered: reports from officials, missives from distant provinces, temple petitions, even occasional weather updates. A eunuch reads them aloud in a steady, neutral voice, never hurried, never dramatic. The Emperor may nod. He may remain silent. Occasionally, he asks for clarification, and a secondary eunuch steps forward to provide context. But this early in the day, most responses are quiet acknowledgements. His formal decisions will come later. Tea is served, not strong, a light infusion to clear the throat, warm the breath. Often it is white tea or pale green, with no added flavors. The teacup is small, unadorned, and handled with both hands. No gestures are wasted. Outside, the light has shifted. The sky is streaked now with soft amber and pale rose. The courtyards begin to echo with distant movement: gardeners sweeping, lower attendants preparing meals, ministers assembling for the daily audience. But here, inside the Emperor's chamber, there is stillness. You step back, hands folded, eyes lowered. Your role has been fulfilled for the morning. You will not speak of what you have seen. You will not mention whether the Emperor looked tired, or seemed troubled, or smiled. Your duty is discretion. Later in the morning, the Emperor will appear in the outer court, flanked by his officials. There will be grand announcements, discussions of policy, perhaps even ceremonies. But none of that could begin without this moment, the quiet work of unseen hands, of eunuchs like yourself, who rise before the empire stirs. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine power as loud and dazzling. But inside the forbidden city, power begins with silence, with stillness, with a bowl of warm water, a pressed robe, and the careful unfolding of ritual. As the sun climbs higher, casting gold across the tiled roofs, the city awakens in full. But your work, for now, slips back into the shadows, waiting for the next bell, the next task, the next breath of routine. Let us continue deeper now into the less visible functions these figures performed, how they held knowledge, secrets, and sometimes control. As the sun climbs higher and the palace fills with more visible activity, couriers trotting through stone corridors, ministers gathering for reports, gardeners trimming precise hedges, there remains an invisible layer humming just beneath the surface. The unseen gears of administration, the private stream of knowledge. It is here that the eunuchs, those quiet servants of the court, wielded a different kind of power. You may picture them as attendants and caretakers, but many eunuchs were something else entirely: librarians of the emperor's memory, chroniclers of his moods, and, in more than a few cases, the silent eyes and ears of the inner court. Let us begin, not with a whisper, but with a brush. Every day, official scribes, many of them eunuchs, recorded the emperor's pronouncements in the court diary. These documents, known as chijuzu or veritable records, were detailed accounts of imperial decisions, observations, and daily activities. Nothing was too small to note. A change in tone, a hesitation, a slight departure from the usual phrasing. All of it was recorded with quiet precision. You, as a court eunuch with scribing responsibilities, sit in a high-ceilinged room, the scent of ink and paper thick in the still air. Around you are bamboo scrolls and silk-bound volumes. You write with a careful hand, each character deliberate. There is no room for error. The ink must not smudge. The grammar must adhere to courtly style. This record is not simply for the present. It will one day be used by historians, perhaps by future emperors, to understand this reign and guide the next. But not all information is written on scrolls. In the vast bureaucracy of the Forbidden City, where hundreds of individuals navigated courtly ranks and rituals, eunuchs played a crucial role in gathering and relaying information. They observed, they listened, they remembered who visited which chamber, who passed whom in the hallway, who spoke softly behind a curtain. This, too, was a form of record-keeping. Some eunuchs became personal confidants of the emperor, walking silently a few paces behind him or standing just to the side of the throne. They were not meant to speak, but they listened, and what they heard they might report or they might remember until the moment was right. In some dynasties, this flow of secret knowledge was formalized. By the time of the Ming dynasty, the eunuch administration had developed its own intelligence network, a group known as the Eastern Depot, or Dongchang. This was a kind of imperial secret police, reporting directly to the emperor, independent of the regular bureaucracy. The Eastern Depot operated quietly. It tracked the loyalty of officials. It investigated slander and treason. It observed religious groups, monitored rumors, and maintained files on both commoners and nobles. Eunuchs led the organization, and their agents moved through society, plain-faced, unobtrusive, ever watchful. For example, one such eunuch, Wang Zhen, rose through the ranks during the Ming dynasty. Though he began humbly, he eventually gained direct access to the emperor and used that trust to control military movements, manipulate court appointments, and eliminate rivals. His influence was not born from brute force, but from knowledge of who said what, when, and where. Yet the lines between loyalty and ambition were often blurred. Another eunuch, Liu Jin, also of the Ming court, led the powerful 8 Tigers, a group of eunuchs who exercised immense control during the reign of the Zhengde emperor. Liu Jin's mastery of information gave him almost unchecked authority for a time. Eventually, he was accused of corruption and executed. His power, though immense, was temporary. Like most shadows, It faded when the sun shifted. But not all eunuch intelligence was political. Within the palace walls, these men also helped manage information on births, deaths, and rituals. They memorized complex genealogies, festival timetables, and ceremonial scripts. If the empress asked for an offering to be made in memory of her mother's birthday, a eunuch would quietly confirm the date, gather the necessary objects, and see to it without a fuss. They knew which concubine had gained favor last week, which had fallen from grace, which gifts had been exchanged between households. This knowledge was never flaunted. It was held, like still water, deep and undisturbed. And so, while the Confucian scholars debated in ornate halls and the ministers issued proclamations, the eunuchs managed the realm of memory and movement, the unofficial rhythms that guided the pulse of court life. To be a eunuch in this role was to live as a ledger, not only recording events but shaping them, gently, through presence and precision. You were part shadow, part servant, part archivist. Your face betrayed nothing. Your words were few. But your understanding of people, of timing, of truth was profound. Not all eunuchs held this level of responsibility, of course. Many remained in more modest roles, but those who did ascend often did so through mastery of observation and trust. They spoke little, but when they did, their voices carried weight. As we move forward, deeper into the power structures of the court, we will explore how this knowledge placed them at odds with another powerful force, the Confucian bureaucracy, a group that viewed eunuchs with suspicion and yet often found themselves working alongside them. Now, let us drift toward the quiet tension that underpinned much of court life in Imperial China, not the kind born of open conflict, but of a slow, steady pull between two groups. On one side stood the eunuchs, ever present, discreet, intimately connected to the palace. On the other, the Confucian scholars, austere, lettered, and formally trained in the ethics of governance. Both claimed loyalty to the emperor. Both served the dynasty. And yet, their relationship was marked by deep suspicion, unspoken rivalry, and, at times, open resentment. To understand this dynamic, we must begin with the Confucian worldview. Imagine a young man from a modest village rising early to study the classics, analects, histories, books of rites. He spends years preparing for the imperial examinations, a grueling series of tests designed not to assess military prowess, but moral and intellectual refinement. The goal is to become a junzi, a gentleman, someone fit to advise the ruler and uphold the Confucian order. Those who passed the highest level of exams were elevated into the imperial bureaucracy. They believed in hierarchy, ritual, benevolence, but also in the notion that government must be guided by educated, ethical men. For them, the palace eunuchs represented a threat to this order. Eunuchs, after all, did not come through the examination system. They were not trained in the classics. They served not the ideal of the state, but the person of the emperor. And therein lay the tension. You see, while scholars were bound to the law and the ideal of virtue, eunuchs were bound to the throne itself. The emperor's will was their compass. If he whispered a command in the dead of night, it was a eunuch who carried it out. If he changed his mind after the morning audience, it was a eunuch who relayed the revision. To the Confucian mind, this was dangerous, unregulated, personal, rather than principled. But for the eunuchs, the Confucians were rigid, self-righteous, blind to the practicalities of life within the forbidden city. Where scholars wrote lengthy memorials, eunuchs solved immediate problems. Where officials waited for the proper protocol, eunuchs acted swiftly. Over the centuries, this subtle contest played out in appointments, policies, and daily routines. Sometimes the balance tilted one way. In the early Ming dynasty, for example, emperors like Yongle elevated eunuchs to positions of real power, entrusting them with foreign diplomacy, military coordination, even oversight of court finances. The Eastern Depot, which we mentioned earlier, operated with little input from the official bureaucracy. Confucian officials protested. They wrote essays warning of corruption, they pleaded for reform, but often their voices were drowned by imperial favor. Other times, the pendulum swung back. When emperors grew wary of eunuch influence, or when a particularly corrupt eunuch was exposed, laws were passed to curb their authority. The Qing dynasty, especially in its early years, tried to limit eunuchs to purely domestic functions. The Kangxi emperor, educated in Confucian ideals, publicly denounced eunuch overreach and promoted the scholar officials instead. Yet even in these times, the eunuchs remained. Not because they defied the system, but because they were part of it, embedded in its rituals, its habits, its human needs. They knew the emperor's moods in a way no official could. They understood the pacing of his meals, the way he furrowed his brow when displeased. They carried his robes, tended his gardens, cleaned his inkstones. This intimacy gave them influence, not always visible, but real. There were even eunuchs who studied Confucian texts, seeking to bridge the gap. Some became patrons of scholarship themselves, funding libraries, commissioning commentaries, or holding private salons with scholars. But still, the divide lingered. If you were a eunuch in the Forbidden City, you would learn to navigate this tension carefully. You would speak respectfully to the officials, defer to their titles, quote the classics when needed, but always remember where your power truly lay, in your proximity to the emperor. If you were a scholar, you might regard the eunuchs as unlettered menials, or worse, dangerous manipulators, and yet you would need them to deliver your messages, to grant you audience, to let you pass through the carved gates of the inner court. It was a relationship built not on trust, but on necessity, an unspoken understanding that each side, for all its misgivings, was indispensable to the functioning of empire, and so the palace endured, its balance maintained by invisible threads. Today, we might look back and wonder how such a system lasted so long. The answer, perhaps, lies in its slow rhythm, its ability to absorb contradiction. In a world where power wore silk, whispered orders, and moved without noise, both eunuch and scholar found their place neither above suspicion, but both vital. In our next segment, we will shift our focus to one of the most powerful roles a eunuch could hold, the custodian of the treasury. For in gold and grain, as much as in ink and incense, the real weight of empire could be felt. Let us now move, with slow and deliberate steps, from the hallways of courtly tension into the storerooms of wealth. Here, in rooms locked by thick wooden doors and guarded by ceremony, as much as soldiers, lay the true pulse of empire: gold, silver, jade, silk, rice, and rare perfumes. The imperial treasury was no vault of treasure in the fantastical sense, but rather a meticulously organized repository of accounts, offerings, tributes, and balance. And among those trusted to oversee it, surprisingly often, stood eunuchs. It may seem strange at first. Why would emperors entrust eunuchs, men without lineage, often viewed with suspicion, to manage such critical resources? But in truth, it was precisely because they had no family, no heirs, no private lands, that they were seen as neutral. The logic followed. With no sons to enrich, no clans to empower, they were less likely to siphon wealth into dynastic channels of their own. Of course, this ideal was not always upheld. Let us examine one figure whose career embodies both the heights of eunuch financial power and the pitfalls that came with it. Liu Jin of the Ming dynasty. But Liu Jin was observant, intelligent, and above all discreet. He learned whom to serve, when to speak, when to remain silent. In time, he became one of the emperor's most trusted servants, rising through the ranks of the inner court until he was appointed to oversee financial affairs. He did not merely handle coinage. He He supervised grain deliveries, timber acquisitions, tax payments from distant provinces, and the redistribution of state resources to various ministries and palaces. His influence extended across the entire economic life of the court. It is said that during his tenure, he began reorganizing accounts, reforming tax records, and tightening control over provincial supplies. In theory, this was beneficial, but over time, his power grew too vast, and his circle too insular. Along with a group of fellow eunuchs, sometimes referred to as the Eight Tigers, Liu Jin dominated court proceedings. He influenced appointments, dismissed rivals, and is believed to have extracted personal wealth from the very treasury he managed. According to contemporary reports, he built a luxurious private residence just outside the Forbidden City, complete with rare gardens and silken draperies. For nearly a decade, he held the purse strings of the empire, but as so often in imperial history, power attracts attention. Whispers grew louder. Ministers accused him of corruption, of hoarding wealth, of manipulating the emperor's favor. In the year 1515, these accusations reached a peak. Liu Jin was arrested, tortured, and executed. His possessions, immense in number, were seized by the state. Yet, even in disgrace, his rise had proven something critical. A eunuch, by virtue of loyalty and proximity, could hold financial authority equal to or greater than any minister. And Liu Jin was not alone in this. Throughout both the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs were routinely appointed to manage palace resources. They ran warehouses filled with ceremonial robes, coordinated the procurement of food for imperial banquets, and oversaw the storage of tribute goods from across the realm. Inside the Forbidden City, nothing moved without being counted. A single shipment of rice might be logged, inspected, and reweighed. Rolls of silk were measured and tagged. Even flower arrangements for seasonal festivals had budgets recorded by hand, in registers maintained with ink and brush by eunuchs trained in arithmetic as much as ritual. Their offices, while modest in decoration, were often humming with activity. Couriers arrived with deliveries. Inspectors reviewed lists. Scribes recorded inventories. And at the center sat the eunuch treasurer, silent, precise, and unwavering. It was not glamorous work. It did not draw crowds or acclaim, but it was vital. In a court where extravagance and scarcity could shift with the emperor's whim, the ability to manage resources calmly was a quiet superpower. Still, with power came risk. The line between efficiency and abuse was thin. A eunuch who miscalculated whether through greed or misjudgment could find himself stripped of rank or worse. For most, the key to survival lay in moderation. Serve well, spend wisely, avoid envy, be neither too poor to be ignored, nor too rich to be envied. For you, had you held such a role, your days would be filled not with gold bars or overflowing coffers, but with rows of neatly folded robes, columns of figures on rice paper, and careful conversations about inventory. And at night, as the city slept, you might pause beneath a lantern's glow, scroll in hand, and marvel at the weight of what passed through your fingers, not power in the traditional sense, but something just as commanding, the empire's balance, measured in goods, grain, and trust. In the next chapter of our journey, we'll leave the storerooms and follow these same eunuchs as they step into another sensitive domain, one even more intimate than treasure, the lives of the imperial women. Now, let us pass from the counting rooms into softer, more secluded chambers, places perfumed with crushed petals, hung with embroidered drapes, and filled with voices pitched low. The inner court, the women's quarters. It was here, behind painted screens and carved lattices, that the lives of empresses, consorts, and concubines unfolded, at once luxurious and stifling, privileged and carefully confined. And at the center of these women's lives stood the eunuchs, silent, watchful, ever-present. It was a strange relationship. At first glance it might seem simple. The eunuchs served the women. They carried their letters, prepared their bath water, trimmed their candles. But in truth, the dynamic was far more complex. For a eunuch, being assigned to the women's quarters was a mark of deep trust and deep exposure. Imagine, for a moment, that you are one of them. Your footsteps are quiet as you move through the courtyard of the Palace of Gathered Elegance. It is early spring, and the plum blossoms have just begun to open. You carry a lacquered tray with writing materials for a high-ranking consort, one who may be summoned to the Emperor's chambers tonight. You do not speak unless spoken to. When you bow, it is deep. When you place the tray upon her low writing table, you do so with both hands, avoiding eye contact. But you are not invisible. You are known, perhaps even trusted. You are the only man allowed into these inner spaces, because you are not, in the view of the court, fully a man. Your presence is not a threat to modesty. Your body, altered by surgery and circumstance, has become your credential. The women here live lives of both refinement and restraint. The Empress occupies her own palace, attended by senior concubines. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of women live within these walls, each ranked in an elaborate hierarchy. They wear silks that indicate their status, eat meals according to their station, and rise or fall according to the Emperor's interest. For many, the hope of bearing a son is paramount. A single night with the Emperor, if it results in pregnancy, can change the course of a woman's life. But access to him is strictly controlled. A eunuch may be tasked with delivering the nightly order, discreetly informing one woman that she is to bathe and prepare for the evening, while others wait in quiet disappointment. You, the eunuch, ensure that everything is correct, that the bathing water is not too hot, that the robes are properly folded, that the perfumes are applied, lightly jasmine perhaps, or sandalwood. You walk a line between servant and confidant, between observer and participant, and yet you must never overstep. Affection is tolerated only to a point. A concubine may speak to you with warmth, may even joke gently, but you must not forget yourself. Palace rumors can ruin lives. A eunuch suspected of impropriety, even if innocent, might be reassigned to menial labor or worse. Still, relationships formed. Some eunuchs became favored attendants. They listened when a lady wept quietly over lost favor. They helped exchange secret letters, sometimes between rivals, sometimes with family outside the palace. Some even advised on matters of fashion or poetry. This proximity came with benefits. A eunuch close to a favored consort might receive better food, finer robes, or recommendations to higher posts. But it also came with tension. Rivalries among the women often extended to their attendants. One misplaced item, one overheard comment, and you might find yourself suddenly out of favor. Historical records give us glimpses into this world. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs assigned to the inner court kept detailed ledgers, lists of cosmetics delivered, fabrics measured, poems copied by hand. Some were so well trusted that they managed personal funds for the consorts they served. Their handwriting appears in the margins of palace inventories and in annotations on embroidered scrolls. It was a world of detail, of nuance, of carefully chosen words, and precisely timed actions. Even leisure was structured. Women painted fans, played chin zithers, and recited poetry, but always with decorum, always under the gaze of rules. And the eunuchs were there, lighting lamps, carrying tea, holding parasols on shaded walks. One might think this life dull, repetitive, but it was full of quiet tension. Ambition hid behind smiles, longing behind practiced grace. And through it all the eunuchs moved like ghosts present, attentive yet never fully part of the world they served. Sometimes they saw joy, the birth of a healthy son, the favor of the emperor resting gently on a concubine's shoulder. Other times they witnessed despair, a forgotten consort, ill and neglected, a new favorite pushing an older one into silence, and always the knowledge that nothing in the inner court lasted. For a eunuch, survival meant adaptability. Read the room before entering it, hear what was not said, know when to speak, and when to simply bow and vanish. This delicate ballet of service and discretion shaped much of court life. And while scholars debated virtue in the outer court, and ministers negotiated taxes in marble halls, in these quiet chambers, another kind of governance took place, one of emotion, presence, and control. And when the sun dipped low behind the red walls and lanterns flickered to life, the eunuchs remained, standing by with folded hands, ready to perform the next task, however small, however vital. Next, we will look at how these men presented themselves, how the court regulated their grooming, their dress, their posture. For even in silence, appearance spoke volumes. Let us now turn to something quieter still, an aspect of court life that rarely makes headlines or fills chronicles, yet shaped every moment of a eunuch's existence: appearance. Within the forbidden city, where every movement was prescribed and every space a stage, the way a eunuch looked, dressed, and carried himself was not a personal matter. It was a duty, an expectation, and a reflection of imperial order. You may think of uniforms as something simple, functional, but for the imperial eunuch, grooming and attire were layered with meaning. Let us begin at the start of the day. You rise before the sun, as always. The candlelight in your quarters is soft, flickering gently as you ready yourself. The walls around you are bare, the floor swept clean. You fold back your sleeping mat and begin your morning routine, not with food or idle talk, but with washing. Water is fetched from the courtyard basin, cool to the touch even in summer. You rinse your face carefully. Your skin must be clean, but not scented. Your fingernails trimmed, no dirt beneath them. Hair is shaved. Most eunuchs kept their heads clean, or nearly so, depending on the dynasty. A few, in later centuries, wore the long braided queues mandated under Qing rule, but often in a modified, less conspicuous form. Next comes the robe. It is not chosen for style, but for station. Eunuchs of the outer court, with lower rank, wore garments of simple cotton or plain silk. Muted colours: ash grey, faded blue, dusty brown. These robes were practical, easily folded and washed by hand. Those assigned to the inner court, or with higher responsibilities, might wear finer materials, polished silks, subtle embroidery, or even narrow borders with geometric patterns, but always subdued. There was no place for extravagance in the garments of a servant. Only the highest-ranking eunuchs, those closest to the emperor, were permitted special insignias on their robes: cranes, waves, or mountains stitched in precise detail. These mirrored the mandarin squares worn by civil and military officials, though always distinct in design and hue. Their purpose was not to elevate the eunuch to officialdom, but to reflect his rank within the complex internal hierarchy of the palace. Your belt is fastened tightly, not for fashion, but to hold small pouches. Inside, a cloth for wiping sweat, a small scroll, sometimes a key. Everything has its place. Shoes are soft-soled, designed to muffle your steps. They are made from layered cloth or thin leather, stitched with care. No heel, no click against the stone paths. Your role is not to be noticed. Grooming does not end with clothing. Posture is part of the presentation. Shoulders relaxed, back straight, eyes lowered. You do not walk quickly, nor do you linger. You glide, quietly, from one task to the next. Hands folded when standing still, knees properly bent when bowing. You are always aware of your body, how it moves, what it communicates, what it conceals. You do not wear jewelry. A ring would be presumptuous, a necklace improper. Perhaps, if your rank permits, you carry a jade pendant at the waist, a subtle marker of position, but only with permission. Even scent is regulated. You may not wear perfume unless assigned to the inner court, and even then, it is applied only at the request of the women you serve. Your natural odour must not intrude. Incense may linger on your robes from temple duty or chamber service, but you would never mask yourself in personal fragrance. There are grooming manuals, written specifically for palace servants, texts instructing how to care for garments, how to remove stains from silk, how to fold a ceremonial fan. In some dynasties, eunuchs received training in hair arrangement and facial care not for themselves, but to assist the imperial family. They were expected to understand cosmetics, but never use them. Even your voice is part of your presentation. After castration, many eunuchs developed high, reedy tones. These were not mocked, they were accepted as a natural result of their condition. But speech was still trained. You were taught to enunciate softly, to avoid speaking unless asked, to bow slightly before addressing a superior. You spoke in court language, not dialect. You called yourself this lowly one, always deferential, always contained. Why such precision? Because the palace was a world of appearances. It was built on ritual, on spectacle, on hierarchy made visible. To dress incorrectly was not just a fashion error, it was a breach of order. It suggested confusion, laziness, or worse, arrogance. To the outsider, the eunuchs may have seemed indistinguishable, similar robes, similar hair, similar behavior, but within their own ranks, they knew exactly who stood where. A slight variation in embroidery, the quality of the fabric, the placement of a sash, all of these communicated status. This emphasis on uniformity was not oppressive, it was stabilizing. When every man knew his role, the court could function like a well-tuned zither, each string perfectly tightened, each note placed with care. And yet, beneath this quiet perfection, individuality found small places to live. A handkerchief folded with care, a stitch of red thread hidden inside a hem, a favorite pair of slippers, worn softer than the rest. These were not acts of rebellion, but of human presence, soft signals in a world of quiet rules. So the next time we picture a palace eunuch, let us not imagine only the robe or the title. Let us remember the careful shaving, the tightly folded garments, the silent walk down corridors lined with watching eyes. Let us remember that even service had a uniform, and in that uniform, a kind of dignity. As we continue, we will now step back to look at the broader picture, the differences between eunuchs of the Ming and Qing dynasties, and how their lives and powers changed across the centuries. Now we pause at a broader vantage point, looking not just at a single life or ritual, but at the long flow of dynastic time. For the story of China's eunuchs is not fixed, it shifts, adapts, contracts and expands across centuries, and nowhere is this clearer than in the contrast between their lives under the Ming and Qing dynasties. Though both dynasties operated within the grandeur of the Forbidden City, the role of the eunuch was far from static. Their duties, power, and even public perception changed significantly depending on the imperial climate. Let us begin in the year 1368, the founding of the Ming dynasty. The founder, the Hongwu Emperor, rose from humble beginnings. A former Buddhist monk and rebel general, he was deeply suspicious of the elite. Perhaps for this reason, he harbored a profound distrust of court eunuchs. Early in his reign, he issued firm edicts restricting their power. They were to handle palace domestic affairs, only no reading of documents, no involvement in government decisions, no private correspondence with officials. And yet, even the strongest walls can bend with time. By the mid-Ming period, emperors grew more withdrawn from daily governance. Some, like the Wanli Emperor, spent long periods secluded in the inner court, interacting only with their immediate circle. Into this vacuum stepped the eunuchs trusted by the emperor, unburdened by the Confucian bureaucracy, and already embedded within the palace structure. They began to oversee correspondence, then finances, then provincial reports, and eventually, as we saw in the case of Lu Jin and the Eight Tigers, they dominated the machinery of the court. By the late Ming, some eunuchs commanded armies, collected taxes, and directed the secret police. Some were revered, others deeply feared, but always their presence was palpable. Now let us turn to the Qing dynasty. Founded in 1644 by the Manchu people from the northeast, the Qing rulers brought with them a different set of customs and a cautious view of eunuch power. They had seen what happened under the Ming. They were determined to avoid the same mistakes. The early Qing emperors, especially Kangxi and Yongzheng, strengthened the role of the civil service, promoted Confucian scholarship, and limited eunuchs to strictly domestic roles. No more running provincial inspections, no more direct control over policy. Their realm became the kitchens, the wardrobes, the incense chambers, and the maintenance of ceremonial objects. And yet, even here, flexibility remained. The Qing court was immense, and the emperor's needs complex. Eunuchs still served as close attendants. They delivered messages, mediated between chambers, and ensured the smooth functioning of rituals. Some rose to prominent positions not through overt political manipulation, but through quiet competence and proximity. One such figure was Li Lianying, chief eunuch to Empress Dowager Cixi in the late Qing era. Though not as politically domineering as Liu Jin, he wielded considerable influence through personal loyalty and careful gatekeeping. His role was less about commands and more about access. He decided who saw whom, who waited where, and which whispers reached the empress's ear. So while the Qing made structural efforts to restrict eunuch authority, individuals still found ways to matter through trust, service, and careful cultivation of presence. Culturally, too, perceptions shifted. In the Ming period, eunuchs were often blamed for corruption and dynastic decline. Scholars wrote bitter essays condemning their influence. Satirical woodblock prints showed them as schemers, whispering poison into the emperor's ear. By contrast, Qing portrayals, especially late in the dynasty, were more ambivalent. In literature and opera, eunuchs appeared as comic characters, or tragic ones, figures of quiet sorrow rather than menace. The politics had cooled. The humanity remained. Their dress changed, too. While Ming eunuchs often wore the square insignia and richly embroidered silks of their rank, Qing eunuchs followed the Manchu-style plain robes, braided queues, and stricter uniformity. Their appearance reflected not individual rank but collective service. And so, what do we learn from this dynastic comparison? That the role of the eunuch was never fixed. It rose and fell with the tides of imperial confidence. When emperors engaged directly, eunuchs stepped back. When rulers withdrew, eunuchs filled the space. They were, in a way, a mirror reflecting the court's balance of trust, power, and vulnerability. But through it all, certain patterns held steady. The eunuch's life remained shaped by ritual. Their presence, though controversial, was always necessary. And no matter the dynasty, they moved in the shadows of power, sometimes near, sometimes far, but never entirely gone. As we proceed, we'll descend from the halls of history into the more intimate corners of palace life, into the rivalries, not of statesmen, but of eunuchs themselves. For when power and silence coexist, ambition does not disappear. It only becomes more careful. As we now continue deeper into the labyrinth of the Forbidden City, the quiet tension beneath the surface becomes more apparent. We have seen how eunuchs moved through corridors of ritual and hierarchy, how they served both emperors and empresses, managed wealth and whispers. But behind these acts of service, another world existed, one hidden beneath silk slippers and shallow bows, the world of internal rivalries. For the Forbidden City, though built on structure, was filled with people. And wherever people gather, especially where power resides, competition follows. Eunuchs were no exception. Though often portrayed as silent and subservient, the truth is more layered. Within their own ranks existed a complex web of status, resentment, and careful maneuvering. And while outwardly they appeared uniform, within the court they were acutely aware of their relative position. Imagine yourself as a mid-level eunuch, assigned to the Bureau of Imperial Kitchens. You oversee the preparation of daily meals, a task requiring precision and punctuality. But above you is a senior eunuch, older, better connected, with a tighter circle of allies. He often overrides your decisions, subtly criticizes your work, and wins favor with the head chamberlain. You begin to notice small changes. Your shift moved later, your requested materials arriving more slowly, nothing overt. But the message is clear: you are being edged out. You dare not accuse him directly. Instead, you must adapt. Build alliances of your own. Befriend a steward in the Bureau of Ceremonial Affairs. Offer small courtesies to a eunuch who controls access to the clothing stores. Each of these interactions is careful, subtle, unspoken. The palace frowns upon politicking, but it flourishes quietly, like moss in the shade. These rivalries were not merely about ego. They determined assignments, food rations, living quarters, even the likelihood of promotion. Some eunuchs served in cool, shaded libraries. Others toiled in the soot-filled kitchens or bitter cold of the storerooms. The difference between the two was often determined not by skill, but by who supported whom. At the highest levels, these rivalries became even more pronounced. Senior eunuchs, especially those with close proximity to the emperor, formed informal factions. They shared information, protected each other from criticism, and sometimes collaborated to sideline a competitor. When one rose too high or drew too much attention, others might quietly remind the emperor of a forgotten mistake or hint at irregularities in a ledger. It was rarely direct confrontation. It was suggestion, deflection, omission. One historical example comes from the Mid-Ming dynasty, during the reign of the Zhengde emperor. Among the emperor's closest attendants were two eunuchs of similar age and influence. At first, they worked in harmony, but as their circles widened, their visions diverged. One advocated for expanded court festivals and entertainment. The other supported increased ritual solemnity. Their rivalry spilled into decisions about staffing, scheduling, and even which musicians played at imperial banquets. Eventually, one fell from favor, not through scandal, but through the quiet erosion of support. One day his name was omitted from the morning registry. He was reassigned to a provincial outpost, a palace far from the capital, with fewer visitors and dimmer lanterns. Within the court, such a reassignment was as telling as any punishment. Of course, not all rivalries were destructive. Some sparked growth. When two ambitious eunuchs competed to provide the finest incense for an imperial offering, the resulting selections improved. When another pair vied for control of ceremonial arrangements, the pageantry became more refined. In these cases, quiet competition drove excellence. But always, the balance was delicate. A single misstep, a boast overheard, a letter misplaced could change a career. Accusations, whether true or not, could destroy years of service. And since most eunuchs had no family or lineage to protect them, they were uniquely vulnerable. Reputation was everything. To guard against this, many kept meticulous records. They stored copies of correspondence, recorded inventory with obsessive detail, and kept small ledgers hidden among personal belongings. These documents served as both proof of diligence and insurance against slander. They also built networks, quiet chains of mutual obligation. You help me secure additional rice rations, and I ensure your nephew's son is considered for a kitchen apprenticeship. These exchanges were seldom recorded, but everyone understood their value. Jealousy could arise not only from rank, but from affection. If a eunuch became too close to a favored consort or prince, others might grow wary. Whispers would circulate. Was he influencing policy, passing secret messages? Position in the palace was never just a matter of title, it was also about nearness, about who saw and heard the emperor in his private hours. Despite the risk, Few withdrew completely from these games. To live in the Forbidden City was to exist in a web of expectations. If you did not advance, you would stagnate. And to stagnate in such a place was a slow, quiet fade into obscurity. Yet even among rivals, camaraderie sometimes bloomed. Eunuchs shared sleeping quarters. They cooked for each other, lent robes, helped one another memorize ceremonial scripts. A man might compete fiercely with another during the day, then sit beside him in the evening, sipping warm tea and recalling a shared childhood in the southern provinces. Palace life demanded both vigilance and humanity. And so, in the soft hush of those endless corridors, friendships formed, alliances shifted, names rose and fell like lanterns in the evening breeze. The rivalries were real, but so too was the understanding that no one else truly grasped what it meant to live this life, this in-between existence of service, silence, and watchfulness. As we step away from these delicate tensions, let us next explore the quiet spaces eunuchs called home their private gardens, the corners of stillness carved from imperial stone. We have followed the eunuch through halls of power and chambers of ceremony, witnessed the intricacies of ritual, rivalry, and responsibility. But now, let us step aside from these roles, even for a moment, and move quietly into the places they returned to when the day was done. Where did the eunuchs live? What spaces did they call their own? The Forbidden City, despite its grandeur, was never designed with comfort in mind. It was a machine of order, yet even within its austere geometry, tucked between walls of lacquered red and rooftops of yellow tile, there existed quiet enclaves, small courtyards, winding garden paths, and modest dormitories reserved for the emperor's most trusted servants. These were the gardens of silence. Imagine it is late evening. The formal rituals have ended. The lanterns are lit, their light pooling softly on the stone. The voices of ministers have long since faded. A few eunuchs remain on duty, but most return to their quarters neither grand nor bare, but sufficient. A typical eunuch's living space was small, sometimes shared with one or two others. The furnishings were modest. A wooden sleeping platform with a straw-filled mattress, a low table for personal belongings, a water basin, and perhaps, if permitted, a scroll or inkstone. There were no family portraits, no heirlooms, no children's voices echoing in the corridor. Instead, there was stillness. Outside the quarters, many of these spaces opened into gardens, not the sprawling kind reserved for the emperor or empress, but narrow paths framed by plum trees and stone lanterns. Small koi ponds glimmered beneath the moonlight. Moss crept between paving stones. Potted bamboo rustled softly in the breeze. These were spaces for quiet, not designed perhaps for the eunuchs themselves, but made peaceful by their presence. It was here, in these gardens, that one might find a few men gathered, not speaking, simply sitting, their shoulders softened by fatigue, their hands resting on their knees. Conversation, when it happened, was gentle. Remarks about the weather, a shared bowl of congee, perhaps a whispered memory of a village far to the south, a mother long unseen, a brother who never returned. Though they lived among splendor, eunuchs were always aware of their separateness. They were not part of the imperial family, nor were they of the scholar class. They belonged to the palace, but not to its lineage. And so, in these private quarters, many cultivated interior lives, rituals of thought, moments of contemplation. Some tended small potted gardens, growing chrysanthemums or miniature pines. Others took up calligraphy, practicing characters late into the night. A few even composed poems, verses carved in ink, never read by the world beyond the red walls. One poem, found scrawled on the back of a bamboo slip during the Ming dynasty, reads, "No sons to mourn me, no daughters to sweep my tomb. Still the plum tree blooms. It is neither bitter nor self-pitying. It is simple, accepting." Eunuchs were not permitted to marry. Many entered the palace as boys and remained there until death. And while some formed bonds, close friendships, alliances, perhaps even quiet romances, these were private, never acknowledged in ceremony. Occasionally, a high-ranking eunuch might be rewarded with a private residence within or near the palace. These homes were slightly larger, with gardens of their own, and servants assigned, but they were still marked by silence, by absence. These living spaces were places of maintenance, not celebration, spaces where life was pared down to its essentials: routine, breath, rest. Even in death, their separateness continued. Most eunuchs were buried in designated cemeteries outside Beijing. One such place was the Mausoleum of Eunuchs near the Western Hills, a quiet slope with simple tombstones, many now weathered by centuries of rain and wind. Some stones are inscribed with little more than a name and years of service. Others bear poems or eulogies written by friends within the court. There were also the precious bundles, the preserved genitalia of some eunuchs, kept in urns or boxes for burial alongside their bodies, an attempt to restore a sense of wholeness in the afterlife. These, too, were placed in their quarters, quietly kept beneath beds or behind partitions, waiting for a final reunion. But while they lived, the gardens remained. A place to fold laundry under a fig tree, a place to sip tea as the crickets chirped beyond the walls, a place to simply be. And so, even in a palace shaped by power and hierarchy, there were corners of stillness, places where the sound of a breeze through pine needles carried more weight than court intrigue, where the fragrance of a plum blossom outlasted the rise and fall of titles. Let us leave these quiet gardens now, but carry their peace with us. In the next segment, we explore the intellectual lives of these men, how many sought not just to serve, but to learn, to read, to write, to master the words that had once excluded them. We have walked with the eunuch through narrow corridors, watched him light incense, tie robes, and fold scrolls. We have seen him stand beside empresses, serve meals to emperors, and keep silent during the whispered politics of the court. But beneath all of this, beneath the soft steps and folded hands, there is something else: thought. The life of a eunuch was not purely physical, it was also intellectual. For to serve in the palace, especially in trusted positions, was to be literate, observant, and quietly adept at reading more than just words. Let us consider what was required to become not just a palace servant, but a competent one. Literacy was essential. The Forbidden City ran on documents: edicts, memorials, daily logs, ceremonial guides, inventories, temple offerings, and imperial instructions, all passed through the hands of eunuchs. To read, write, and copy these documents with precision was a core skill not just for record keepers, but for those in nearly every bureau. Young eunuchs, after their acceptance into the palace, were often enrolled in basic instruction. This was not the classical Confucian education offered to scholar officials. There was no deep study of the 4 books or the 5 classics, but it was rigorous nonetheless. They learned to read palace shorthand, to recite standard formulas used in imperial speech, to recognize ritual terminology, to distinguish between common and honorific characters. These skills were taught by elder eunuchs, men who had long ago mastered the rhythms of court language and now passed it on to the next generation. The instruction was practical. A student might copy the same ceremonial phrase 100 times by decree of the emperor, son of heaven. He would learn how to fold a letter, how to hold a brush without splattering ink, how to write in narrow columns with balance and care. Mistakes were not taken lightly. A poorly written name on a ceremonial scroll could be interpreted as an insult. For those who showed aptitude, further training was possible. Some eunuchs became scribes, assigned to draft messages, annotate reports, or maintain the court diaries. These roles demanded not only literacy, but memory. If an emperor asked for a report from 3 months earlier, a competent scribe was expected to know where it was stored and what it contained. If a name appeared in 2 different petitions, he should recall whether that individual had previously been reprimanded. Other eunuchs worked in ceremonial offices where education was expressed through performance. They memorized the order of ritual offerings, the layout of ancestral tablets, the exact positions of kneeling mats during a festival. These were not written down for reference, they lived in the body, passed from hand to hand, word to word. And then there were the few those whose hunger for knowledge exceeded what was expected of them. Some eunuchs, especially those assigned to the palace libraries or cultural bureaus, took it upon themselves to read beyond their training. They studied poetry. They practiced calligraphy in the spare hours between dawn and dusk. They read ancient histories and annotated them with neat brushstrokes in the margins. Occasionally, their work survives. Archaeologists have recovered documents marked not with the stamps of official scholars, but with the quiet notes of eunuch readers. In one palace archive, a Confucian commentary on the Book of Rites bears the tidy observations of a eunuch scribe who questions whether a particular ritual was still followed in the modern court. His tone is measured, curious, entirely devoid of ego. Such traces remind us that these men were not merely tools of bureaucracy. Many developed sharp minds, nuanced understanding, and a deep love of order not just in duty, but in thought. It is worth noting that education offered a path to advancement. A eunuch who could read a court memorial aloud without faltering, who could recite a list of ancestral titles from memory, or who could draft an imperial acknowledgement in elegant script was more likely to be noticed and more likely to be trusted. And yet, despite this competence, there were limits. Eunuchs could not take the civil service exam. They were excluded from the class of scholar officials. They were not invited to the Confucian salons where poetry was exchanged and philosophical arguments debated. Their learning remained in the shadows, acknowledged by some, envied by others, but rarely celebrated. Still, they studied, not for applause, but for necessity, for pride, for understanding, and their education extended beyond text. A eunuch's intelligence was measured not only in written words, but in his ability to read the court, its moods, its silences, its layered etiquette. He learned to speak volumes with a bow, to correct a mistake without blame, to deliver bad news without offense. These were not subjects taught in books. They were absorbed through observation, refined through repetition, and tested daily. And in the quiet hours, when duties were complete and gardens lay still, many returned to their brush and ink. They copied Buddhist sutras. They wrote poems not meant for others to read. They practiced the brush strokes of the emperor's name, again and again, until their hand no longer trembled. For in the palace, to write the emperor's name with care was more than duty. It was reverence, it was survival, and, for some, it was a kind of devotion. As we prepare to move into more public rituals, let us carry with us this quieter wisdom that behind every scroll delivered, every report read aloud in court, stood a eunuch, literate and unseen, shaping the empire in ink and silence. Next, we'll follow that ink into one of its grandest expressions, the coordination and execution of imperial banquets, a celebration of abundance, precision, and rank, all carried on the backs of those who knew how to serve without being seen. The Forbidden City may have seemed a world of silence and restraint, but it also hosted some of the most elaborate displays of wealth and ritual in the pre-modern world. At the center of these spectacles were the imperial banquet ceremonies, not of casual dining, but of precise symbolism, hierarchy, and lavish abundance. And moving silently behind the tables, the trays, the bowls and banners, were the eunuchs. For these men, a banquet was not a celebration. It was an orchestration, one requiring weeks of preparation, dozens of roles, and perfect discipline. Let us imagine such a day. It is the mid-autumn festival, a time of mooncakes and poetic toasts. The emperor has decreed a formal banquet in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Invitations have gone to members of the court, selected officials, visiting dignitaries, and favored scholars. The menu has been finalized. 8 courses, each symbolizing harmony, longevity, prosperity, or celestial order. But long before the first plate is served, your work begins. As a eunuch assigned to ceremonial logistics, you rise early, not just on the day of the feast, but weeks in advance. The list of attendees must be cross-checked, dietary preferences noted, seating positions confirmed with the Bureau of Rights. Every guest's rank determines not only where they sit, but which dishes they may receive and how many courses they will be served. In a court where status is everything, these distinctions matter. The kitchens begin preparing ingredients 3 days prior. Oxen are slaughtered. River fish arrive, packed in damp rush baskets. Mushrooms, dried scallops, lotus seeds, and ginger are sorted and cleaned. In side courtyards, lower-ranking eunuchs peel, soak, and trim under the direction of seasoned cooks, many of whom are eunuchs themselves, trained in the culinary arts for decades. Each dish is symbolic. Sea cucumber with duck represents flexibility and stability. Swallow's nest soup signifies refinement. Lotus root cakes shaped like chrysanthemums evoke purity and autumn grace. Even the color arrangement on the serving platters carries meaning. As the banquet day arrives, the air in the palace shifts. The courtyards are swept thrice. Hanging lanterns are replaced with fresh ones, red silk, gold tassels. Decorative screens are repositioned to conceal cooking, smoke, and frame the emperor's path through the hall. And you, the eunuch coordinator, move through it all like a conductor without music. Your steps are measured. You check that the gold-trimmed bowls have been polished, that the silver chopsticks have been placed with their engraved ends outward, that the servers, also eunuchs, know the precise count of each guest's rank, so they know when to bow, when to kneel, and when to retreat. When the emperor enters, all stand, then kneel, then stand again, in a wave of choreographed reverence. No words are spoken unless spoken to. The emperor may utter a poetic phrase or gesture toward the moon. The guests will nod appreciatively. Toasts will follow. Behind the scenes, dozens of eunuchs move like clockwork. The head of the beverage bureau ensures the warmed rice wine is poured to the correct level, never too full, never less than protocol demands. The servers move in a particular sequence, each holding a tray with both hands, their eyes lowered. The dishes are presented from left to right and cleared in the same order. You keep time in your head. You know how long each course should remain. You signal, not with voice, but with a small gesture, a flick of the sleeve, a subtle tilt of the chin. One team enters, one team exits. No crashes, no delays, no missteps. Music plays in the background, a slow Guccian melody, performed by female musicians from a screened alcove. The sound is soft, barely above a murmur. It is not meant to entertain, but to reinforce the dignity of the occasion. And through it all, the eunuchs do not eat. They remain poised, observant, attentive. Even as steam rises from the dishes and the aroma of lacquered pork and 5-spiced duck fills the air, they remain untouched. Their meal will come later, modest bowls of rice and broth in the rear kitchens. When the banquet ends, it does so not with applause, but with a quiet nod. The emperor rises, the guests bow, the lanterns are dimmed. You oversee the removal of each dish. The tablecloths are rolled. The uneaten food is documented and, in some cases, sent as gifts to absent officials. The scrolls announcing the evening's poetry are stored, and you, once again, fade into the background. Managing an imperial banquet was not about spectacle, it was about seamlessness. To do it well was to make it look effortless. And the eunuchs did it again and again, every new year, every seasonal festival, every birthday celebration of the emperor's mother or favored consort. These events, while rare for most of the population, were the regular pulse of life inside the palace. They reminded everyone, not just guests, but servants and eunuchs alike, of the structure of the empire, who belonged where, what symbols carried what meanings. and how everything, down to the placement of a radish carved into the shape of a crane, had its purpose. As we step away from these tables, let us next examine what happened when structure faltered, when protocol was broken, and punishment had to be delivered. For eunuchs, like all who served the court, were subject to discipline, and sometimes they were the ones called upon to carry it out. Let us now descend into a shadowed part of court life. For all its pageantry and protocol, the Forbidden City was not free from fear. Beneath the careful etiquette and perfect silence, there lurked consequences. When rules were broken, when loyalty faltered, punishment followed, and the eunuchs, often so quiet and unobtrusive, were not only witnesses to this side of power, sometimes they were its hand. While eunuchs are often remembered for their service roles carrying trays, tending robes, guarding chambers, they also held, in certain periods, authority over palace discipline. In particular, during the height of their influence in the Ming dynasty, they were frequently placed in charge of interrogations, inspections, and the enforcement of imperial will. To understand this role, we must first recognize a simple truth. Trust is not passive. The emperor, as son of heaven, relied on the perception of order, but he could not be everywhere. He could not see who whispered in a side corridor or who altered a ceremonial script. And so, just as he entrusted eunuchs with managing meals and messages, he also entrusted them with keeping the court in line. Imagine now a senior eunuch, perhaps one with decades of service, respected, feared, and closely associated with the emperor himself. His voice is calm, his eyes rarely blinking. When the emperor suspects theft, corruption, or sedition, it is to this man that he turns. Find the truth, he may say, or simply go, and the eunuch understands. Let us walk now into a room behind the Hall of Literary Glory, not marked on most maps, not used for rituals or poetry recitals. It is an interior chamber, unadorned save for a scroll stand, a writing desk, and a small brazier burning slow coals. The room is quiet, the walls thick. Here, those accused of wrongdoing are brought not always for punishment, but for questioning. Eunuchs were known to oversee these inquiries, and sometimes to conduct them. They were trained not in the art of persuasion, but in the discipline of protocol. A eunuch questioning a palace servant who misfiled a decree would begin not with threats, but with records. "You served under whom?" he might ask. "What hour was the document received?" Each question delivered in the same tone, with the same slow clarity. For minor infractions, late arrivals, missing items, improper bows, the punishment might be a demotion, extra duties, or loss of monthly rations. Eunuchs often delivered such notices in person, without fanfare, handing over the revised appointment scroll with a lowered gaze and folded hands. But more serious offences such as leaking information beyond the palace walls or altering imperial edicts were met with more direct force. The Eastern Depot, a powerful intelligence agency during the Ming era, was staffed and directed by eunuchs. Its agents moved quietly through the city, gathering information, reporting rumours, and, at times, detaining those who strayed from the approved order. While technically separate from the regular judicial system, the depot had considerable autonomy. Historical records mention the use of internal palace prisons, dark cells located beneath administrative buildings or secluded near the outer court walls. Eunuchs assigned to these facilities were often chosen for their discipline and loyalty. They did not speak of what they saw, they did not boast of what they oversaw. And while they may not have administered beatings or floggings themselves, they were the ones who unlocked the doors, who held the keys, who marked the time of each confinement in their ledgers with neat strokes of the brush. There is one account, preserved in a Qing dynasty memoir, of a eunuch who, when asked why he oversaw so many punishments without protest, replied simply, "To refuse would be disloyal." To enjoy it would be disgraceful. To carry it out in silence, that is duty. It is not a justification, it is a reflection. Still, not all punishments were severe. Eunuchs also administered ritual correction, assigning menial tasks to offenders, moving them to less favorable quarters, or denying access to certain spaces. These actions, while subtle, carried weight. In a court where every step mattered, a single relocation could change a life. Eunuchs themselves, of course, were not immune. When a eunuch overstepped, spoke out of turn, abused power, mishandled a ritual, they too faced discipline. The same hands that served tea one day might the next be washing floors, their sash colour stripped, their title erased from the registry. In extreme cases, they could be imprisoned, banished, or executed. This created a climate not of terror, but of unrelenting attention. Every gesture mattered. Every silence held meaning. There were also stories quietly passed between the quarters of eunuchs who turned these powers to their own ends. A personal rivalry resolved through a fabricated report, a position gained by removing a competitor under pretense of investigation. These tales may have been exaggerated, or not. In a world so tightly wound, truth and caution often blurred. Yet it would be misleading to view eunuchs solely as agents of punishment. Most never held such roles. Most served, obeyed, observed. But for the few who did step into that shadowed responsibility, their actions helped maintain the court's fragile balance between law and loyalty, mercy and control. And when the punishment was over, it was they who recorded it, filed the report, folded the paper, and returned to silence. As we leave this chamber and step once more into the daylight of court routines, we turn now to something even more delicate, the private emotional lives of these men, the bonds they formed, the friendships and, in rare cases, the affections that bloomed in the spaces between service and solitude. Even in the most ordered world, humanity finds its way through the cracks. A shared glance, a whispered conversation, a gentle hand placed briefly on another's sleeve. For all the structure, formality, and ritual that governed life in the Forbidden City, the palace was still filled with people. And where there are people lonely, dutiful, aging, hoping there will always be connections, let us now turn our attention to the quietest of relationships, the ones not written in the court records, the ones never celebrated in public ritual, nor acknowledged in official titles. These were the forbidden friendships and tender bonds of the eunuchs, subtle, essential, and almost always invisible. In the eyes of the court, eunuchs were to be emotionless, not cruel or harsh, but neutral, calm, available, undistracted by attachments or personal ambition. They had no wives, no children, and no inheritances to protect. They were meant to be instruments of the emperor's will, unclouded by longing or desire. And yet, they were human. Imagine a palace dormitory just beyond the Hall of Preserving Harmony. The hour is late. Most of the palace sleeps. Two eunuchs sit beside a brazier in silence. One, older, nurses a mild cough and stares into the flames. The other refills a cup of hot water and passes it over without speaking. No thanks is needed. The gesture itself is the language. Their rooms are side by side. Their duties occasionally overlap. Over time, they have learned each other's rhythms when the older one rises, what foods he avoids, how the younger one prefers to copy his inventory logs, standing rather than sitting. These are details only familiarity provides. Nothing improper has occurred, nothing that would spark punishment. And yet, even such closeness is quietly discouraged. Why? Because closeness implies loyalty of a kind not directed solely toward the emperor. It implies the sharing of thoughts that might never reach an official report. The possibility that a eunuch might, in a moment of conflict, choose friendship over duty. And so, friendship itself, if it grew too warm, was viewed with suspicion. Yet it persisted. Eunuchs often spent decades in the palace. They lived in close quarters, worked long shifts together, and navigated the same rules and hierarchies. They watched one another age, saw each other's mistakes, helped one another recover from punishment or illness. In a life that offered little room for self-expression, friendship was often the only private refuge. Some of these relationships were deeply emotional. Letters have been found tucked into books, folded into old sleeves, or scribbled on scraps of paper that speak of affection between eunuchs in poetic and understated terms. "When I do not see you in the morning," one line reads, "the corridors feel longer." Another, more formal, begins, "To my dear friend, with whom the tea always cools too slowly." Were these romantic in nature? Perhaps, perhaps not. The line between deep friendship and romantic love is never easy to draw, especially in a world where emotional language had to wear a mask. In some rare cases, eunuchs are recorded as having committed acts of deep loyalty for one another, defending a colleague against accusations, transferring to less desirable posts together, or even choosing to retire at the same time so they would not be separated. One pair is said to have shared a burial plot, with matching tombstones bearing each other's names and the phrase, "companions in service, companions in silence." These gestures were rare, and often noticed only after death. Within the palace, even expressing grief openly was regulated. A eunuch who lost a close friend might not be permitted to mourn publicly. He would still have to perform his duties, still bow, still carry trays and deliver messages. And yet, in the quiet space of a garden bench or beside a softly smoking censer, the sorrow might show in slower movements, in a gaze that lingers too long on nothing. The emotional life of a eunuch, then, was lived mostly in the margins, in careful words, in folded sleeves, in long pauses between formal duties. And yet, it is impossible to understand the human experience of the Forbidden City without acknowledging these bonds. They were not scandals, they were survival. When a eunuch sat by another's side during illness, or shared his better robe during winter, or taught him how to hold a calligraphy brush with more grace, it was not political, it was human. And in a life shaped by service, sacrifice, and silence, such small acts took on extraordinary meaning. We often imagine the palace as a place of power, and it was, but it was also a place of isolation. Friendships among eunuchs were not only personal, they were necessary. They offered comfort, a sense of self, a reminder that behind the uniform, behind the role, there was still a person breathing, thinking, hoping. As we continue, we will step away from emotion and return to duty once more into the palace's night patrols, where eunuchs walked darkened corridors to ensure the empire's order continued even in sleep. Let us now walk into the hours most people never see, not the bright moments of ceremony or the quiet intervals of tea and brushwork, but the deep, dark hours of the palace night. When the torches are lowered, when the music ceases, when even the moon seems reluctant to shine too brightly. For while the Forbidden City slept, it did not slumber completely. Someone always watched. Someone always walked, and more often than not, that someone was a eunuch. Night duty was a necessary part of palace life. Despite the seemingly inviolable nature of the emperor's household, theft occurred. Fires broke out. Messengers arrived at odd hours. And sometimes, secrets needed to be passed not under the high beams of ceremonial halls, but in the soft silence of midnight. Eunuchs were trusted with the night. Imagine yourself rising just as the last court lanterns are extinguished. You dress in your simpler night robe, still proper, still precise, but less adorned. Your lantern is lit with slow-burning oil. It casts a dim yellow glow, just enough to see the outlines of stone paths, wooden balustrades, and the ever-present shadows of carved columns. You do not patrol alone. Night duty is divided into watches. Each team is assigned a specific section of the Forbidden City: the outer court, the residential quarters, the hall of mental cultivation, the gate corridors, and the inner gardens. You walk slowly, not to avoid suspicion, but because there is no rush. The rhythm of the patrol is meant to be calming, constant, like the breathing of the palace itself. As you walk, you listen. Your ears grow accustomed to the noises of the night. The soft creak of beams contracting in the cold, the distant hoot of an owl perched atop the hall of supreme harmony, the soft patter of a rat scurrying across roof tiles. These sounds no longer startle you, they're part of the rhythm now. You check lanterns to ensure they remain lit in the few critical junctions. You examine the hinges of doors to make sure none have been forced open. You inspect the incense altars to see that embers have been properly doused. These are small duties, but none of them are unimportant. From time to time, you encounter another patrol. You greet each other with a silent nod, perhaps exchange a word or two, always whispered, always brief. To speak too loudly at night was considered disruptive. The emperor, empress, and consorts slept nearby. Their slumber was not to be disturbed, but not all eunuchs at night were on patrol. Some remained in designated alert rooms, ready to be summoned. If the emperor awoke and requested a specific document or dictated a midnight edict, a eunuch was already waiting. If the Empress Dowager called for her favorite tea due to a dream that unsettled her, a eunuch would quietly step into her antechamber, bow, and deliver. And then there were those who listen. Whispers, by their very nature, favor the night. The absence of bustle, the thinning presence of witnesses, it made the shadows ideal for quiet conversations. And court intrigue, subtle and slow-moving, often gained its momentum not at banquets or audiences, but during these hushed intervals. A eunuch assigned to guard a concubine's quarters might overhear a passing remark about another consort. A eunuch delivering scrolls might notice two officials meeting in an unlit pavilion when none were scheduled to speak. These observations, rarely reported directly, were stored, remembered, filed away in the mind until they were useful or dangerous. Sometimes it was not what you heard that mattered, but what you didn't. A missing attendant, a locked door that should have been open, a note slipped from one sleeve to another. The court was careful, but not perfect, and in the stillness of night, even perfection begins to fray. It was in these quiet hours that a eunuch's discretion was most vital, to know when to pass something upward to a superior, to the chief of the bureau, and when to say nothing. For speaking too often could be seen as gossip, too little, and one risked being accused of negligence. But night patrol was not all secrets and suspicion. There were moments of beauty, too. Standing at the edge of a moonlit pond, the stone lions reflected in the still water, watching a sudden gust of wind stir the plum blossoms loose from the branch, listening to your own footsteps echo off the marble tiles. In such moments, a eunuch could feel that the palace itself was breathing alongside him. There were also dangers. Winter nights were bitterly cold. A eunuch caught dozing during his patrol could be severely punished, especially if anything went amiss. A fire breaking out due to a neglected lamp wick could lead to loss of rank, lashings, or exile. In the Forbidden City, responsibility never truly rested, and so the eunuchs walked, hour by hour, breath by breath, marking time not with clocks, but with incense sticks placed in holders, each designed to burn a known length. When the stick had turned to ash, it was time to switch shifts, to return to the sleeping quarters, to leave the night behind. But sleep, for many, did not come easily. There were those who lay awake, listening still, even after their duty ended, and in their minds replayed the steps, the whispers, the brief flashes of movement just out of the lantern's reach. The Forbidden City never truly slept. It only paused. And the eunuchs, more than anyone, became its caretakers through those long, slow hours. In the next segment, we will turn inward toward the beliefs that sustained these men beyond their duties, their private prayers, their offerings, their quiet hopes for the afterlife. We have walked with the eunuchs through their duties and their silences, watched them serve emperors and empresses, and seen them navigate the delicate dance of friendship, power, and restraint. But beneath all of this, beneath the ceremonies and the ranks and the endless obedience, each man held within himself a quiet question. What comes after? For eunuchs, men severed from family lines, barred from traditional legacies, and excluded from the ancestral rites that shaped so much of Chinese society, this question was not academic, it was deeply personal. The belief in the afterlife, in karmic balance, in ancestral remembrance was threaded through the culture of the court, and yet the eunuch's path through that spiritual landscape was different. Let us begin in the quiet corner of a palace garden, where a single stick of incense smoulders beside a smooth stone. A eunuch bows 3 times. He does not pray aloud. He places a folded slip of paper inscribed with characters drawn in careful brushwork into a small brazier and watches it burn. He is not performing an official ritual. This is not part of court protocol. This is private. Many eunuchs, though cut off from bloodlines, embraced a blend of religious beliefs to guide their inner lives. Buddhism, Taoism, folk religion, and Confucian ritual all found their way into their hearts, not in strict doctrinal form, but in practice daily, modest, intimate. Buddhism offered much. The idea of suffering, rebirth, and detachment from worldly desires resonated with many who had endured early trauma, lived in solitude, and served without legacy. Temples within and near the Forbidden City were often staffed or visited by eunuchs. Some donated part of their small wages to have prayers said in their name. A few, upon retirement, even took monastic vows, finding in Buddhist robes a final uniform of peace. The Bodhisattva Guanyin, embodiment of compassion, held special meaning. In art, Guanyin is often depicted as neither fully male nor female, serene, wise, transcending simple categories. For eunuchs, whose identities straddled similar ambiguities, this figure offered both comfort and reflection. Taoism, too, found a place. Some eunuchs sought balance in the rhythms of Taoist breathing exercises or placed charms for protection near their sleeping mats. A handful visited mountain temples during brief leaves of absence, seeking guidance from hermit monks who promised health, longevity, or release from suffering. But more often, spirituality was practical, not lofty. A red paper charm affixed to a doorframe, a whispered chant before entering the emperor's chamber, a pouch of herbs sewn into a robe's lining to ward off misfortune. These were quiet gestures, acts of hope in a world where security was never guaranteed. And then there was the afterlife. For most Chinese men, the afterlife was not just a spiritual realm, but a familial one. A man's soul was believed to be sustained by the offerings and remembrance of his descendants. His name was inscribed on ancestral tablets, incense burned in his honor during festivals. But for eunuchs, who had no children, this system was closed. What then? Some found solace in monastic communities, asking monks to maintain their memory through prayers. Others arranged for fellow eunuchs to care for their graves, reciprocating agreements made in life. A few purchased burial plots in dedicated cemeteries, like the famed Eunuch Cemetery south of Beijing, where rows of modest tombstones bear names now weathered by time. Among these graves, archaeologists have discovered small urns believed to hold the Bao Jian, the removed genitalia of the eunuch, preserved since the day of their castration. It was thought that, if buried together with this part of the body, a eunuch's soul might be whole in the afterlife. It is a belief not loudly proclaimed, but it speaks volumes. Some left poems carved in stone. One epitaph reads, "Though I bore no seed, my service stood firm. Let the wind carry me now, as incense drifts upward." Not every eunuch pondered such things. Many lived day by day, fulfilling their tasks, passing quietly through the ranks, leaving behind no written word, no recorded prayer. But others turned inward, as they aged, turning their gaze from the jade and silk of court life to the simple flame of the spirit. They fasted before certain holidays. They refrained from meat on festival days. They copied sutras by candlelight in careful calligraphy. These were not dramatic acts. They did not seek recognition. They were private harmonies in a lifelong practiced in minor keys. And in the end, many were remembered by the things they left behind: a well-maintained altar, a lacquered box filled with personal writings, a pair of slippers perfectly folded beside a mat. These remnants were not grand, but they were sincere. In the next chapter of our journey, we will witness what happens when even the highest eunuch's fortunes turn, when a powerful faction built in silence and proximity begins to crumble, and the palace, once again, decides to shift its balance. Because their strength was borrowed, derived not from family, military backing, or exam results, but from proximity, from nearness to the emperor, from trust built quietly over years, and just as easily erased in a moment. And so it was that even the most powerful eunuch factions, those that shaped appointments, oversaw investigations, and carried the emperor's words as if they were law, could rise and fall with dizzying speed. Let us step into one such fall. The Ming dynasty, early 16th century. The court is presided over by the Zhengde emperor, a ruler both eccentric and indulgent, with a love for spectacle and novelty. He often bypasses his ministers, preferring the company of entertainers, soldiers, and most especially his eunuchs. Among them rises a man named Liu Jin. Liu Jin did not begin in splendor. He came from modest roots, entered the palace as a young boy, and endured the long climb through lowly duties and rigid routine. But he was observant, careful, and understood better than most the nature of imperial moods. Liu Jin formed a network of fellow eunuchs, men loyal not only to the emperor, but to him personally. This group became known, unofficially, as the Eight Tigers. They coordinated court affairs, oversaw the Eastern Depot, the Imperial Secret Service, and held sway over appointments, taxation, and even military logistics. It was an unprecedented concentration of influence. Ministers grumbled, scholars penned cautious memorials. But the emperor, pleased with Liu Jin's efficiency and devotion, ignored them. For a time, Liu Jin seemed untouchable. He constructed a private residence near the palace, grand enough to rival a noble estate. Rumors spread of hidden treasures, of lavish feasts held in secret, of bribes accepted in exchange for promotions. The Eight Tigers acted as gatekeepers not only to the emperor's ear but to opportunity itself. But power, in such a delicate world, attracts light and scrutiny. A rival official, Yang Yiqing, began compiling evidence, quietly, patiently. He documented discrepancies in reports. He traced missing revenues. He watched and waited. Then came the turning point. Liu Jin's enemies presented their findings to the emperor. Initially skeptical, Zhengde hesitated, but the details were too precise, the financial losses too large, the public murmurs too loud. At last, the emperor relented. Liu Jin was arrested. He was interrogated not in an open court but within the palace confines. He was charged with corruption, abuse of power, and endangering the stability of the realm. His fall was swift. The other tigers scattered, some stripped of their posts, others imprisoned. Liu Jin himself was sentenced to the traditional punishment for high treason, death by 1,000 cuts. Yet in the court records, little emotion is found. The same brush that once recorded his appointments now documented his demise. One account, however, offers a glimpse of reflection. A scribe noted that as Liu Jin awaited execution, he asked only that his brush and inkstone be buried with him. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "They served me honestly even when I did not." Whether the story is true or embellished, it speaks to something deeper, the awareness that power held without humility, especially by those already viewed with suspicion, was a fragile thing indeed. But the fall of a faction did not erase the presence of eunuchs in the court. New ones rose, new alliances formed. The emperor could not rule alone. And so, once again, quiet men in silk robes walked the corridors, some remembering Liu Jin's rise with admiration, others his fall with caution. This cycle repeated in quieter echoes across the centuries. Even in the Qing dynasty, where eunuch power was more tightly controlled, occasional figures gained favor and then lost it just as quickly. A slip of the tongue, a shift in the emperor's trust, a forgotten ritual or a mismanaged ledger, and the tide turned. For eunuchs, influence was not to be clutched, but held loosely, not displayed, but exercised through care, through knowledge, through invisibility. And even those who wielded it most impressively often left the palace not in triumph, but in silence. As we leave this tale of ambition and collapse, we turn to a different perspective: how those outside the palace, particularly foreign observers, viewed these enigmatic figures. Misunderstood, mythologized, and often inaccurately portrayed, eunuchs left an impression not only on China's emperors, but on the world that peered cautiously through the gates. Let us now shift our gaze not from one corridor to another, but from inside the palace walls to the world beyond them. For centuries, the Forbidden City stood at the heart of the Chinese Empire, closed, immense, and deeply ceremonial. To the average subject, it was distant. To foreign eyes, it was utterly opaque. And yet, from time to time, travelers, envoys, missionaries, and diplomats glimpsed this world, and with them came impressions, interpretations, and misunderstandings. Few figures within the palace inspired more confusion, fascination, and myth than the eunuchs. To European observers of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Jesuit priests, French envoys, British consuls, the eunuch was a puzzle, a man without family, without visible political title, yet capable of influencing the emperor's decisions, overseeing domestic affairs, and even speaking on behalf of the throne. To cultures that emphasized public masculinity, hereditary power, and clerical transparency, the idea of a castrated man holding authority within the world's most powerful imperial court was, at best, perplexing and at worst, threatening. We can read their reactions in journals and letters, often composed in candlelit rooms after tightly monitored audiences with Qing officials. These records mix careful observation with clear bias, shaped by the values and anxieties of the author's home countries. One Jesuit, writing in the mid-17th century, described the eunuchs as phantoms in embroidered robes who whisper like ghosts and vanish into curtains of brocade. He admired their discipline, but mistrusted their secrecy. Another European visitor, less generous, called them mischievous intermediaries who poison the ear of the dragon throne, attributing delays in communication and perceived slights to eunuch interference. He believed, erroneously, that the eunuchs read all foreign letters aloud to the emperor and censored anything that displeased them. There were also misunderstandings about their role in court rituals. Some visitors, unaware of the division between ceremonial and administrative eunuchs, assumed that all such figures were intimate advisors to the emperor. In truth, most eunuchs, particularly in the Qing dynasty, were limited to specific domestic or logistical functions. Their proximity to the throne did not always mean influence. Language further complicated matters. Westerners often referred to eunuchs using terms borrowed from Greco-Roman history: palace slaves, imperial harem guards, domestics. These words carried associations from their own histories and failed to capture the structured and often highly specialized role eunuchs played in the Chinese system. And of course, there were the exaggerations. Rumors circulated among trading communities in Canton and Macau that eunuchs controlled all access to the emperor, that they demanded bribes to allow audiences, that they ran shadow governments from within the Forbidden City. Some of these stories had kernels of truth, particularly during the Ming dynasty, when powerful eunuchs like Liu Jin rose, but many were embellished or imagined entirely. The lack of transparency fed these myths. Foreigners were rarely allowed beyond specific gates. Their interactions were highly choreographed, and when a eunuch appeared silent, unsmiling, bearing a scroll or gift, it was easy to project onto him a sense of menace or manipulation. But some observers saw more. Several Jesuits, permitted extended stays in Beijing and tasked with teaching astronomy or mathematics to the Qing court, came to appreciate the complexity of the palace's inner workings. They noted the precision with which eunuchs executed ceremonies, the literacy required to maintain temple registries, the hours of silent labor required to keep the court functioning. One priest described an elder eunuch as a man of immense quiet dignity, who knew the names of stars and the order of ancestral rites better than any minister I met. Another recounted how a eunuch corrected his pronunciation of a ceremonial phrase, doing so not with arrogance, but with a gentle smile and a subtle bow. Even so, stereotypes endured. In Western literature of the 19th century, eunuchs often appeared as stock figures, conniving, delicate, effeminate, and treacherous. They were cast as villains in Orientalist tales, symbols of decadence and decay. Their real humanity, their discipline, education, loneliness, and quiet pride was flattened into caricature. This distortion was not limited to fiction. Early Western historians of China sometimes blamed eunuchs for the fall of dynasties, echoing old Confucian critiques that painted them as corrupting forces. In doing so, they overlooked the deeper patterns of governance, policy failures, environmental factors, and external invasions that shaped dynastic decline. Only in more recent decades have scholars begun to revisit the role of eunuchs with fresh eyes, examining their writings, studying their tombs, translating their documents, and reconstructing their lives not as shadows, but as individuals within a rigid and complex system. These new perspectives reveal what many inside the court already knew, that the eunuchs were not all-powerful nor powerless, not saints nor monsters, but men trained, disciplined, cautious, and constantly navigating a space between presence and erasure. To foreign eyes, their existence may have seemed unnatural, but within the Forbidden City, it was precisely their ambiguity, neither ruler nor ruled, neither family nor official, that made them indispensable. As we return from the gaze of outsiders, we turn now toward the final years of their story. What happened when the dynasty fell, when the palace gates opened, when the world changed, and the old systems crumbled? What became of the eunuchs then? As the imperial era neared its end, the world inside the Forbidden City, so carefully preserved for centuries, began to unravel. The dynastic system which had shaped every inch of the eunuch's life fell into quiet ruin. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, and with it, the foundations upon which the eunuch's identity, role, and security had long rested. But the eunuchs did not vanish overnight. For a brief time, even after the abdication of the last emperor, Puyi, life within the palace continued in an almost ghost-like version of itself. Puyi, still a child, was allowed to reside in the inner court of the Forbidden City under a special agreement with the new republican government. With him remained a small retinue of loyal servants, including several hundred eunuchs. These men, though stripped of much of their political importance, continued to fulfill ceremonial roles. They maintained the gardens, lit incense before the ancestral tablets, prepared meals, and stood watch by unused thrones. But something fundamental had changed. The emperor no longer ruled, he simply resided. And with that shift, the eunuch's authority, already fragile and dependent on imperial favor, began to dissolve. Gradually, their numbers dwindled. Some were dismissed by reform-minded officials who viewed their presence as an outdated relic of feudalism. Others left voluntarily, sensing that the rhythms of the world had changed, and the walls that once protected them now stood for nothing. Imagine a eunuch in his 70s, his hands still steady from decades of practice, his speech precise, his back slightly stooped from a life of deference. He walks the length of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, knowing it may be the last time. The ceremonial fans have been removed. The cushions no longer await the emperor's arrival. The throne sits untouched, quietly gathering dust. For this eunuch, the collapse of the dynasty was not only a political event, it was personal disorientation. Who was he, if not a servant of the emperor? Where would he go, if not within these walls? Some attempted to return to the outer world, but the transition was rarely smooth. Having entered the palace as boys, they had little experience navigating life beyond its gates. Many had no surviving family. Others found that the world no longer understood them. Their speech, their dress, even their gait seemed foreign in the modernizing streets of Beijing. A few found employment in private households as caretakers or temple assistants. Their skills in etiquette, calligraphy, and quiet service were appreciated by the older generation. But these roles lacked the stability and dignity they had once known. Others fell into poverty. Without pensions, many elderly eunuchs found themselves living in makeshift dormitories, sharing rooms with fellow retirees. They sold keepsakes from their palace days, brushes, robes, scrolls to tourists or collectors. Some even became subjects of curiosity, performing old palace rituals for coins in public parks, wearing faded uniforms and reciting incantations they once whispered beside emperors. One of the last imperial eunuchs, Sun Yaoting, became known in his later years for sharing his memories with journalists and writers. In his youth, he had entered the palace in the final years of the Qing, hoping for a lifetime of service. Instead, he witnessed its decline from within. His memoirs, recounted late in life, provide a rare, poignant window into that twilight world. He described the sorrow of watching younger eunuchs wander the streets, aimless and unemployed. He told of how, even in the 1932nd and 42nd, he would gather with other former court servants to light incense for emperors long gone, not because they still held power, but because remembering gave them a thread of meaning. The eunuchs outlived the system that created them, and that, in many ways, was their final burden. In 1924, Puyi was expelled from the Forbidden City altogether. With that, the last eunuchs officially in imperial service were dismissed. Some remained nearby, forming communities on the outskirts of Beijing. Others disappeared from the record, returning to rural villages where their history was known only by whispers. Yet even in those final decades, they retained a quiet dignity. They polished their shoes every morning. They folded their bedding with military precision. They addressed one another by proper court titles, even when living in shared tenement housing. Their discipline, once a matter of duty, had become part of their being. When the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, eunuchs, by then elderly and few in number, were viewed with a mix of sympathy and disdain. Some were interviewed by ethnographers, others were left alone, their stories slowly fading with them. By the end of the 20th century, fewer than a dozen remained. They were no longer servants nor symbols of empire. They were witnesses to a world that no longer existed, to a palace that had become a museum, to rituals whose meanings had been archived, and in their silence there lingered both loss and peace. In the next segment, we will explore the physical traces they left behind, their tombs, epitaphs, and the subtle ways in which memory, even of such quiet men, persists. What remains of a life when the voice is gone, when the robes are folded one final time, when the Forbidden City has closed its gates for good? For most imperial eunuchs, their legacy was never carved in marble or spoken of in halls of power. Yet beneath the soil around Beijing, in quiet corners long overlooked, lie some of the final clues to their existence: tombs, epitaphs, urns, and fragments of ritual. Together, They offer a muted chorus of voices from men who lived behind curtains, in silence, and often in service. Eunuchs were not entitled to imperial burial rites. They were not sons, fathers, or heads of clans. And yet, many of them saved meticulously throughout their lives to ensure they could be buried with dignity. Even in death, propriety mattered. Some found rest in modest cemeteries just beyond the capital's outskirts, places like the Eunuch Cemetery near Beijing's Western Hills. Walk its grounds today, and you'll find no towering monuments. Instead, rows of simple stelae, some now cracked by age, stand in quiet formation. Their inscriptions are understated but precise. On one stone, faithful in silence, loyal without question. On another, he served in snow and sun, in court and garden. May he find peace where duty ends. These epitaphs rarely mention rank or titles. Instead, they focus on qualities of character, loyalty, discipline, restraint. It is a subtle kind of remembrance, but sincere. Some tombs included small carved guardian figures, lions, turtles, or mythical qilin. Not grand in scale, but placed with care, they suggest a desire for protection in the afterlife, a continuity of order even beyond the mortal realm. Of particular note are the burial urns known as baojian boxes. These small containers, often made of wood or ceramic and lined with silk, are believed to have held the removed genitalia of eunuchs preserved at the time of castration and stored throughout their lives with great care. According to traditional belief, burying this part of the body with the rest was a way of restoring bodily wholeness in the afterlife. Many eunuchs kept these boxes in private altars or hidden chambers. Upon death, they would be interred together. Some even had special niches built within their tombs, just large enough to hold the small sacred box. Modern archaeologists have uncovered several such boxes, some containing only silk and ashes, others with small charms or inscribed slips of paper tucked inside. One fragment bore the phrase, "May I walk upright in the land beyond." Not all eunuchs could afford such preparations. For those of lower rank or limited means, communal burial plots were common. Groups of eunuchs who had served together often arranged to be buried side by side, continuing their companionship into death. A few rare plots include paired tombstones marked not as family, but as brothers in duty or companions in service. Inside the Forbidden City, a few eunuchs earned the extraordinary honor of commemorative tablets within the palace itself. These were almost never placed during their lifetimes, but sometimes, after many years of faithful service, an emperor or empress dowager would authorize such an inscription. One such tablet, now housed in the Palace Museum, reads simply, "He was always near and never spoke out of turn." Such inscriptions are haunting in their restraint. They tell us little of personal joy or ambition. Instead, they record presence, constancy, precision, and a life defined not by legacy, but by unbroken attendance. Yet even among these quiet graves, stories linger. Visitors to the Eunuch Cemetery in the 1982nd recalled finding old men seated near the stones, dressed in worn but tidy robes, placing incense or flowers at the foot of certain markers. These were surviving eunuchs, now elderly, paying respects to former colleagues. They sat not in mourning, but in meditation, heads bowed, hands folded in the same manner they once used before emperors. They spoke little. One visitor recalled asking an old man why he came so often. The reply was soft, "Because we remember each other, and no one else will." In modern times, some of these cemeteries have fallen into neglect. A few tombs have been relocated for preservation. Others have been lost entirely to urban development. But efforts to catalogue and restore them are underway. Historians, archaeologists, and museum curators are beginning to recognize the value of these spaces, not just as curiosities, but as records of a unique and deeply human life within the machinery of empire. And so, even in their afterthoughts, the eunuchs remain as quiet presences in the stone, as names still etched in fading ink, as stories beginning once more to be heard. In our next segment, we will explore how modern historians are re-evaluating these men not merely as servants of empire, but as agents, as individuals, as witnesses to centuries of change. Time, with all its shifting priorities and passing generations, does not always preserve reputations evenly. Some lives are remembered in bronze, others in books, and still others only in whispers. For centuries, imperial eunuchs in China lived at the intersection of record and rumor, appearing in official documents only when they rose too high or fell too hard. For the most part, their stories were left in the margins. But history does not stay still forever. In the modern age, a growing number of historians, both within China and abroad, have begun to revisit the legacy of eunuchs not as caricatures or cautionary tales, but as fully realized participants in the complex machinery of imperial rule. And in doing so, they are uncovering a world far richer and more nuanced than earlier chronicles ever suggested. Much of this reassessment begins with the question, who were the eunuchs really? They were not merely servants, nor were they mere power brokers. They were archivists, tutors, artisans, astronomers, musicians, and logisticians. They managed the movement of thousands within the palace each day, ensured the ritual calendar was kept without error, and supervised everything from water supplies to textile stores. Modern scholars now view the eunuch institution as a form of parallel governance. The Confucian bureaucracy ran the empire beyond the walls, while the eunuchs ran the world within. Though their influence fluctuated, more expansive in the Ming, more constrained in the Qing, their importance remained constant. Recent research has brought forward their voices, long obscured. Court diaries written by eunuchs, once dismissed as minor, are now being translated and studied for their detailed descriptions of daily life, ritual timing, and personal reflection. These records reveal a striking sense of duty. Entries are filled with notations about incense offerings, imperial moods, weather patterns, and the correct alignment of ceremonial objects. In one diary fragment, a eunuch notes, "The emperor did not speak today, but accepted the tea. His silence was calm, not displeased. The calligraphy scroll was well received." Such lines speak not only of observation, but of emotional intuition, an awareness of mood, of nuance, of unspoken currents in a court where a single raised eyebrow could change a life. Scholars are also revisiting the old Confucian critiques. Historically, Confucian historians viewed eunuchs with suspicion. Because they lacked family ties and did not pass the imperial examinations, they were seen as operating outside the moral structure of filial piety and scholar-official ethics. Any rise in eunuch power was interpreted as a sign of dynastic decline. But modern historians now argue that this was often a convenient narrative used by bureaucrats to explain political failures without implicating themselves. By scapegoating eunuchs, they could maintain the appearance of scholarly virtue. Reassessing the Ming dynasty, for instance, scholars now recognize that many of the so-called power-hungry eunuchs were, in fact, acting within their assigned roles. Figures like Zheng He, who led the massive maritime voyages of the early 15th century, or Wang Zhen, who oversaw palace security and regional inspections, were not overreaching. They were responding to gaps in administrative structure or the emperor's own delegation of duties. Another revelation has come from archaeology. Excavations of eunuch tombs, as discussed previously, have yielded not only burial artifacts but personal documents, letters, lists of possessions, even poetry. These writings reflect men deeply conscious of their place in the world, not always sorrowful, not always resentful, but reflective, often philosophical. One poem found in a sealed lacquer box reads, "In silence, I walked where power passed. With ink I wrote, though not of my own name. A shadow among jade halls, not lost, only quiet. Such words challenge the older view of eunuchs as mere opportunists or victims. They show self-awareness, dignity, and perhaps even a subtle critique of the very court they served. In recent decades, public history has followed suit. Museums in China, once hesitant to dwell on the topic, now include exhibits on court eunuchs. Visitors to the Palace Museum in Beijing can see tools used in daily rituals, uniforms worn by senior eunuchs, and scrolls bearing their calligraphy. Documentaries have been produced, dramatizations aired, and academic conferences held on the subject. This shift reflects broader changes in Chinese historiography, an effort to understand history not only through the lens of emperors and ministers, but through the lives of those who made the court function day after day, year after year. Even in global scholarship, eunuchs are no longer viewed as an isolated phenomenon. Comparative studies have emerged, linking the Chinese eunuch system with those of Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire, and ancient Rome. These studies explore how gender, power, and institutional trust intersect in societies across time and geography. And through this wider lens, something remarkable becomes clear. Eunuchs, once defined by what they lacked, are now being studied for what they sustained, for their presence, their precision, and their perseverance. For the rhythms they maintained long after the drums of politics had quieted. As we prepare to conclude our journey, we will turn inward once more to reflect on what it means to live in between worlds. Neither wholly privileged nor wholly oppressed, neither fully visible nor forgotten. What does it mean to live a life of silence and survival, and to be remembered not in triumph but in stillness? And now, as we near the final moments of our journey, we are left with stillness. Not the stillness of absence, but of reflection, of quiet that settles like dust in an old corridor where footsteps once echoed and robes brushed stone floors with disciplined grace. The life of a royal eunuch in Imperial China was not one of bright banners, galloping horses, or speeches carved in stone. It was a life lived in between servant and sovereign, between man and machine, between individual and institution. To speak of eunuchs is to speak of absence. And yet, that absence of children, of inheritance, of bodily integrity, is not all they were. Within that space they built something else: discipline, subtlety, purpose. They became masters of a form of power that did not shout. It listened, it learned, it waited. Imagine one last time the hush before dawn in the Forbidden City. In a distant chamber, a eunuch rises long before the sun. He folds his mat, smooths his robe, and prepares the morning tea for a man he will never truly know, but whose every sigh he has memorized. He lights incense not with piety, but with exactitude. The scent rises slowly, curling into the carved beams above. He does not hurry, he does not pause, he does not wonder aloud if anyone will remember him. He simply continues. This rhythm, repeated 1,000 times over centuries, created the inner architecture of the Chinese court. While emperors came and went, while dynasties crumbled and were rebuilt, the eunuchs remained anchoring the rituals that bound a vast empire together. They were constant in a world where constancy was rare, and yet, for all their presence, they left behind remarkably few traces of self. This was not because they lacked thought, or longing, or joy. It was because their role demanded a kind of inward folding, a silencing of personal narrative in service to something larger. But in the quiet corners of archives and tombs, in the careful calligraphy of forgotten scrolls, we glimpse them, their restraint, their observation, their patience. In modern times, the question of identity has come to the forefront in new ways. We speak now of autonomy, of expression, of gender, of memory, and in this contemporary language, the eunuch's story resonates once more not as a relic of feudal control, but as a deeply human negotiation of constraint, survival, and dignity. What does it mean to be shaped by forces you did not choose? What does it mean to live with loss and still serve, still create, still care? These are not just questions of history, they are questions of existence. For some, the eunuch is a symbol of suffering. For others, a symbol of strange privilege. But perhaps more accurately, he is a mirror, one that reflects how societies assign value, how they craft roles, and how individuals carve meaning even when the script has already been written for them. It is easy to overlook such lives, easy to focus on emperors, battles, reforms. But history is also written in ink that fades, in footsteps not recorded, in names that do not appear on monuments. The eunuchs were such names. Their lives remind us that presence is not always loud, that service, when freely chosen or faithfully borne, can be an act of great strength. That silence, though often mourned, can also contain clarity, and that survival, steady, composed, humble, is itself a legacy. Now, as we close this chapter, take a moment to sit with that quiet. Let it settle around you like the dawn mist in a palace courtyard. Let it remind you that even the smallest, softest lives leave patterns like brushstrokes on silk, like incense curling toward an open sky. And then, breathe, gently. You are no longer in the court. You are here, still, safe, and ready to rest. And so, our journey comes to an end. From the echoing marble halls of the Forbidden City to the soft earth of forgotten tombs, we have followed the quiet paths walked by royal eunuchs, paths shaped by duty, discipline, and silent resilience. These were not men of grand speeches or celebrated deeds, but of quiet repetition, invisible labor, and the daily choreography that kept an empire turning. Their lives were marked by constraint, yes, but also by agency, by intellect, and by a steady grace that defies easy summary. As you lie here now, eyes growing heavy, let their world drift gently through your mind. The rustle of robes, the flicker of lanterns, the scent of incense rising toward intricately carved beams. Let their silence surround you not as emptiness but as presence, as a gentle reminder that even the quietest stories matter. May your rest be as peaceful as the gardens they once tended, and your dreams as steady as their unbroken rituals. Sleep well,